If you're brand new to using Bubble or no code, then this is the video for you. In this video, I'm going to take you from Bubble beginner to not so much a Bubble expert, but someone who is intermediate and dangerous enough to know what they're doing to build and ship their own custom app. Look, the purpose of this video is to get you up to speed as quickly as possible. After all, the whole purpose of using a tool like Bubble is the efficiency and speed that comes without having to write a single line of code. Now look, if you're brand new to the space, hello, my name is Lachlan, and I've been using Bubble for over 5 years now. When it comes to no-code tools, Bubble is by far my favorite. What I found along my journey is that most no-code tools just do one thing well. So whether it be creating a database, allowing you to connect different services together, build some sort of user interface, or even create custom workflows. But what I love about Bubble is that it includes all of those things in one single platform. So it truly is the one-stop shop when it comes to no-code tools. I like to think of Bubble like it's the avatar of no-code. So in Avatar: The Last Airbender, there's each of the individual nations who master their craft. But of course, the avatar is the one who can master all of those things. So that is Bubble. Now look, throughout this course today, I'm going to explain absolutely everything you need to know from scratch. So whether it be setting up a custom database, building the interface of your app, learning how to stitch everything together and make it functional using visual workflows, learning how to use features like custom states, URL parameters, option sets, and of course, absolutely everything else in between. By the end of this course, I'm hoping you'll have absolutely everything you need to know in order to start building and shipping your own custom app. Now look, full disclosure here, this is a completely free course. Some of my courses charge money, however, this one is on the house. So sit back, grab your Bubble editor, and get ready to learn a whole lot of valuable insights. Within this module, I'm just going to start by taking the time to explain a couple of core concepts that you really need to grasp when it comes to working inside of Bubble. Now look, thankfully, these are pretty straightforward. Before we jump into our course today and talk about all of the technical things you need to know about using Bubble, I first just wanted to take the time to look at all of the no-code tools available and just discuss when and why you should even use a tool like Bubble and what exactly Bubble is used for. So that way, if you've got a specific project in mind that you want to bring to life, I just want to first make sure that this is the right tool for you, so that way I don't waste your time and you don't waste your own time. Now look, when it comes to my course today, I just have a checklist of all of the items I'm going to be teaching you about all of the different topics inside of Bubble. Now this checklist is just in a tool called Notion, which is just a note-taking and documentation tool I use. What I love about Notion is that you can actually just check items off as you have added them into Bubble. And look, I'll be sure to share a link to this specific checklist with you, so that way you can make a copy and follow along with me. But before I even consider opening up Bubble, what I want to do is just show you a couple of quick slides which just highlight, as I mentioned before, the main features of Bubble. Now look, bear with me, I really don't want this to be boring for you, but it is important that we cover this first, so that way you know exactly what you're getting yourself into. So if I just open up my slide deck here, the first thing I want to do is just talk about the state of no-code tools. Now, as you can see within this image, there is a million different types of no-code tools, which all do very specific things. There's particular no-code tools for things like creating CRMs. There's tools for workflow automation. There's tools for hosting databases. And look, this is just one of the images I found about the current state of the no-code industry. I'm sure there is a million other no-code tools out there, all trying to, I guess, get your attention. And so before you even try and build an application, it's important to make sure that you've selected the right no-code tool for the job. But if you're brand new to this space, what on earth is a no-code tool? Look, I'm going to imagine that you have some sort of understanding at this point. But most no-code tools, as the name would suggest, allows you to create a fully functional application without having to write a single line of code. Now, another word you might hear when it comes to no-code tools is something like visual programming. So although there is technically no coding required, you do still need to build complex or technical things like logic or workflows. Now, what on earth are those buzzwords I just said? It's just a way of actually making your app functional. So if, let's say, a user signs up for your app, you want to create an account for them inside of your database, and then you'll want to display their information on things like their profile page or their settings page. So all of that doesn't just magically appear from fairy dust. You actually have to build that out still. However, instead of having to manually write technical code that looks quite complex, you do it all using a visual programming language. So it's a lot of the drag and drop things that you see from a lot of screenshots out there. And thankfully, visual programming is a million times simpler and easy to understand than any coding language. The way I always explain it is visual programming is just like creating with Lego blocks. So if you've ever played with Lego, I can guarantee you're going to be able to use a tool like Bubble. So in short, you can go from something like this, which to me just looks like complete gibberish. All I see is a bunch of pretty colors on a terminal here, but none of this makes no sense at all to me, to something like this. So this is a screenshot from Bubble's workflow tab. So this is essentially creating the example I just explained, where when a user signs up to an application, we want to do something. So as you can see here, we have an action. So when a user clicks on the register button, what we're going to do inside of this action is sign the user up, and we're going to store their email and their password, and that's going to be put directly inside of our Bubble database. And then once this step is done, we're going to create another step which sends them to a page, and that could be something like their profile page or even their settings page, where we can then display that information that they've just created for their account. So if I had to choose between a direct comparison of being able to code or being able to use a visual programming language, I can guarantee you 9 times out of 10, I'm going to choose this, because this to me actually makes sense. So from here, I just wanted to quickly talk about when you should actually use a tool like Bubble. Because of course, there's so many different no-code tools out there. Particularly in this day and age, there's no-code tools that are starting to compete with platforms like Bubble. So you've got things like Webflow, Adalo, Zapier, Airtable, Flutterflow. I could truly sit here for hours and ramble on all of the no-code tools. But obviously at this point in time, you're interested in using something like Bubble. So I just want to first verify that this is the right tool for the job. So you should use Bubble if you're trying to build a dynamic application. Now, once again, that is just a completely random buzzword that I've thrown at you. So what on earth does that mean? Something you're going to hear when you're using Bubble is the word dynamic time and time again. So when you're building some sort of website or application, you're going to hear 2 key phrases. There's the word static, and then there's the word dynamic. And thankfully, the difference between the two is super straightforward. So let's say if I am a small business and I want to build a website that just displays some information about who we are, our opening hours, and then I want to put something like a map on there to just show where our actual shop is. In that case, I'm creating a website that is not going to change. So that information I put on that website will always remain the same. So that is known as a static website, because the information on there will never change. Once I put my opening hours on there, they're probably always going to be the same. I mean, of course, I could log in and change them, but 99% of the time, that information will remain the exact same. Then you have what's known as a dynamic application. So these are fully blown applications that you use on your day-to-day life. So things like Airbnb, Tinder, Uber Eats. These are applications that constantly change based on the information a user puts in. So let's take an example of something like Instagram. If you were to create an Instagram account, what you would be required to do is put in your own information. Then as you start using that app, what you see as a user will be completely different to what I see as a user, because your feed of all of the content you're going to see is going to be based on your interests, whereas my feed is going to be based on my interests. So although we're both using the same application, we're going to have 2 entirely dynamic experiences. So the word dynamic just means that every user's experience is going to change and be catered to them. And this is the true power of Bubble. In Bubble, you can create dynamic applications. So whenever you need to host user accounts, so if you want users to sign up to your app and create something or view some data, this is when you should use a tool like Bubble, because that's when you're creating a dynamic experience. So in hindsight, when your users need to create an account and when they need control over what's going to be created. So in my example of Instagram, users can obviously create posts or share reels. So they're the ones who are creating the content that's going to dictate all of the information in your app. So when it comes to tools like Bubble, particularly when you're creating dynamic apps, this is just a small example of some of the applications you can actually build. So you can build things like on-demand services. So this is kind of like your Uber or DoorDash example, where at a click of a button, you can get someone to bring something on demand to you. There's social networks, so things like Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, directories, SaaS tools, and marketplaces. Marketplaces is a super popular one with Bubble. And look, these are just some examples that I've created myself. These are just some basic screenshots, but I've been able to replicate a whole suite of popular apps that most people use in their day-to-day life. So this is my exact Etsy clone that I've created, and this is my Instagram clone that I've created. So as you can see, these look quite similar to the real-world applications, and that's because they actually function like the real-world applications as well. So if you're ever looking to build any product like this, Bubble is going to be your go-to tool. Now, just as it's important to understand when you should be able to use Bubble, it's also essential to know when you should not use a tool like Bubble. And thankfully, I pretty much already explained this when I walked through the difference between static and dynamic applications. So if you're ever trying to build a static website or just a basic landing page, you should not use a tool like Bubble. Although you can technically use Bubble to build a static website, it's not really what it's used for. It's like getting a rocket ship to go to the corner store. You just don't need it. So you can always use other tools like Webflow, WordPress, Card, or Squarespace. Those are going to be perfect for you. The other thing is if you ever need to develop something like a fully fledged game. Although I've seen some people rebuild games like Wordle or a Dungeons and Dragons simulator, Bubble is not built to actually create custom games. Now, the other thing I should talk about when it comes to Bubble in comparison to other no-code tools is what you can actually do with it. So most no-code tools on the market are kind of like the elements from the TV series Avatar. Now, if you're a fan of Avatar: The Last Airbender, I think you're really going to love this illustration, as it really helps me drive my point across. Most no-code tools on the market do one thing exceptionally well. So they master one of the elements. So you can have tools like Webflow or WordPress that give you complete control over the design of your website or application. So these are like our waterbenders. Then over here, we've got tools that allow you to build something like a database. So tools like Airtable and Coda are going to allow you to host all of the data and information you need. But of course, if you ever want to connect that data to something and extract that information, you're going to need to use a tool which will allow you to integrate with other third-party tools. So for our airbenders here, we've got tools like Zapier and Integromat. So each of these no-code tools has mastered one element. And as good as that is, it can also be a little bit problematic. And so what do I mean by that? If you were to build an application using something like Webflow, you would need to actually design it inside of that tool, host your database in something like Airtable, and then create a connection between your database and Webflow using a tool like Zapier. So before you even start, you're going to have to learn how to use 3 different tools. You're also going to have to pay 3 different subscriptions, which is just going to take a whole lot of time and create a massive headache for you down the track. And so this is why I love a tool like Bubble. Bubble is essentially the avatar of all no-code tools. It's mastered every single element inside of one single platform. So Bubble is a complete water, air, fire, and earthbender inside of one. So with Bubble, you can create your own custom database to store information about your users. You can design the entire application directly inside the platform. You can stitch it together and make it functional using visual workflows. And look, if you still need to connect with third-party tools and services, you absolutely have the ability to do that. Bubble can connect with any API under the sun, and it also has a bunch of pre-built plugins which can actually simplify that entire process again. So Bubble is the be-all of no-code tools. There's very few tools on the market that encapsulate everything you need inside of one platform. So with Bubble, you're only going to pay one subscription. You're going to have all of your user data stored in one platform. You don't have to worry about learning multiple different tools. And that's just going to mean that you can build and get your app out there into the market as quickly as possible. And look, for now, that's absolutely everything I want to cover about why or when you should use a no-code tool like Bubble. I'm going to assume that you've already started learning about Bubble because you knew that you needed to create something like a dynamic app, although you might not have known that it was called a dynamic app. But from here, what I'm going to do is just jump back into my checklist for our tutorial today and just tick off that I've finished explaining all of the different core concepts in a high level. Now, of course, within our guide today, I'm going to break down a specific module on each of these concepts so that way you can fully understand how to get the most out of them. But for now, I don't want to bore you to death with any additional PowerPoint slides, so why don't we move on to our next section of the course. Within this module, I'm just going to highlight and explain what types of applications you can actually build when it comes to using Bubble's no-code platform. Now look, the options are pretty limitless, but there are a few limitations that I just want to take the time to explain. The purpose of this section of our course is to just quickly explain what exactly you can build with Bubble. And look, this is going to kind of be like an extension of our last module, so I'm not going to take up too much of your time here. But essentially, I just wanted to take the time to run through all of the different types of applications you can create with Bubble. So that way, if you see the app you're trying to create is on this list, you know for a fact that it can be done. Now, of course, this list doesn't cover every single use case in Bubble. What I do typically say is that if you can think of it, you can create it inside of Bubble. I also just wanted to take the time to share some additional resources that showcase some of the apps that have been built in Bubble. So that way, if you want to take a look at what someone else has created, it could give you some inspiration or some reassurance that someone has created the exact features you're looking for. So at the top of my list are things like marketplaces. So a lot of people build a lot of marketplaces inside of Bubble. It can do exactly that. Whether it be a property marketplace like Airbnb, a car marketplace, a place where you can sell secondhand goods. Marketplaces are a hot use case which can definitely be done. There's on-demand services. I've mentioned this in the previous module. So things like Uber, DoorDash, and of course every other delivery service there is. In Bubble, you can do a lot with processing payments and GPS tracking. So it's going to help you create the exact experience you're looking for. There's also social networks and community apps. Now, I see a lot of people building social networks in Bubble, and it can definitely be done. Bubble essentially allows you to create an experience where users can sign up for an account, they can create and publish content, they can engage with each other's content, so being able to like and comment on posts or even share those. And you can create an algorithmic feed which makes sure that only content that's interesting or relevant to a particular person will be shown to that individual. Every single person will have a unique feed to them. So that's why Bubble is the go-to tool if you're creating something like a social network. You can also build e-commerce stores. So if you wanted to create something like Amazon, Shopify, or even just a basic e-commerce store, it can definitely be done. Although if you are just trying to build a standard e-commerce store, I do think something like Shopify will be a better solution for you. But if you're trying to build something a bit more custom, so something like Etsy, for instance, which kind of is an e-commerce store, but it's like a marketplace, it's a hybrid between them both, this can be done. Or if you're trying to create something like an auction website, so kind of like what eBay was in its early days, where you can bid and then have people counteract those bids, that is going to be what you can do inside of Bubble. There's booking apps, so things like if you want to schedule appointment slots, so tools like Calendly or ZocDoc. So that way, if I was, let's say, a doctor, I could put in my availability and then people could go and book an appointment with me. Once again, we could process payments so they could pay me for that appointment. And then I could create a dashboard where it allows me to track all of my upcoming appointments as well as see my previous appointments. You can also create tons of dashboards. Bubble is the best tool for creating dashboards. There's so many plugins that allow you to create custom charts and visualizations. So if you've got any data you need to explain, whether it be something like an internal tool, or if you're trying to build something like a stock trading platform, Bubble can display all of that information to your end users. Which leads me to my next point, which are things like internal tools. So if you've got internal communication tools, so something like Slack or a time tracking tool or project management tool like Asana, Monday.com, these can all be done. There's also invoicing and finance apps. So if you're trying to build something like QuickBooks, Xero, MYOB, this can all be done as well. And I guess the last thing I just wanted to show you is a list of all of the resources here. So that way, if you want to take a look at some of the apps that people have already created, you can definitely check that out. So the first resource is the Bubble Showcase page. So if you head to bubble.io/showcase, or of course you can just click the link in my checklist that I've included. If you scroll on down, Bubble has a list of all of the different success stories on that platform. And if you click on these, they have a case study about what the person was trying to build, and it talks about the specifics of the application. They'll also include some screenshots of what the application looks like, as well as a link to go and view that application. So that way you can see it in the wild and see how it looks and feels. So I'd always recommend checking out the showcase page. Bubble also has a great blog post which just includes some examples of what you can actually build inside of Bubble. So this is the next resource. If you scroll down, it pretty much just kind of covers the list that I've walked you through. But once again, they'll include some screenshots and share some real world examples of what has already been built. So you can see there's things like custom marketplaces, and they've got some links to some examples here. And look, 9 times out of 10, it'll probably send you back to the showcase page where you can learn more about this specific application. But look, there's tons of things on this. So you'll see social networks, booking apps, personal finance tools, community and review sites. The list goes on. And the last resource I just wanted to share was my list of clone courses that I've created. So my big thing is that I teach people how to rebuild clones of apps they already know and love. Now, the reason I do that is because most people, when they actually have an app idea, they're not trying to create something brand new or revolutionary. If you're anything like myself, when I first had my app idea, I took inspiration from an existing app, but I just wanted to put my own twist on it. So for instance, most people don't want to build an exact Airbnb clone that competes with Airbnb. Instead, they might have an idea for a property marketplace within their specific region, or they might want to build some sort of marketplace like Airbnb, but for cars or bikes or boats. So I think the best way to understand how to use a tool like Bubble is to rebuild an app that you already know and love. Because you know the specific features that power each application, so you know exactly what you're going to create. And look, by the end of it, you'll have a fully functional app. So I'd recommend heading to my website and checking out these list of courses. Now, the main reason why I wanted to show this is just because this is quite an extensive list. So if you load all of these, you'll see the list of apps that I've been able to rebuild inside of Bubble. So pretty much anything under the sun. Now, look, that's all I wanted to cover within this section of our course today. I don't want to take up too much of your time because within the next few modules, this is where we're actually going to start to dive into how we can actually use Bubble. And this is where all of the exciting stuff begins. Inside of this section of our course, I'm going to explain absolutely everything you need to know about creating and structuring your own custom database inside of Bubble's platform. Now, this can definitely be a little bit overwhelming if you are brand new to Bubble, but please don't stress. I'm here to walk you through the entire process. I hope you're ready because this is where we're going to dive into our very first core concept inside of Bubble. And what better way to start than covering the most technical and hard thing there is. No, look, I'm kidding. But right now, what we're going to do is focus on how we can structure our very own database inside of Bubble. Now, the reason why I wanted to cover this first is because when it comes to actually building an application, this is always the very first thing you should do before you even open up your Bubble editor. So please make note of that. I see a lot of people who make the mistake of actually designing their app inside of Bubble first, and then they leave the database as an afterthought. So they have to manually go back and set up their database according to their design. Now, the problem with that is when you're creating a custom database, you need to actually think hard about how you can optimize that database for the best possible structure. Now, I know that's going to sound quite overwhelming if you are brand new to Bubble. And look, I remember when I first started, setting up a database was probably one of the harder things that I had to do. The process of actually setting it up is easy to do, but it's more just taking the time to sit down and think about the proper schema that you should create. And what do I mean by schema? Schema is just a fancy way of saying the layout of the database. And so by the end of this video today, you're going to understand all of the core concepts that are required to create a custom database. I'm also going to walk through a live demo where we're going to set up a brand new custom database. And in that demo, we're going to recreate the database of something like an Instagram app. So we've got a social media site where you can share photos or videos, and we're literally going to create every single bit of information we need to store in our database. So you'll have something to show by the end of the course. So before we jump in, what I want to do is just open up a brand new Bubble editor. Now inside of this editor, I haven't changed a thing, but what you'll notice is that on the left-hand side of your Bubble editor, there's all of these different tabs. These are quite important. This is where you can access every core feature of Bubble. So there's your design tab, which is what you see here. This is the default tab where you can actually design the interface of your app. So whatever you see here is what your users will see. But below that, I just wanted to point out that there's the data tab. So when we click on this, this is going to open up our database. Now, if you're anything like me, when I first came to this page, I was kind of underwhelmed in a way. And I mean that in the best way possible. When I originally thought of creating a database, I thought it was this big complex thing that was almost like a black box. You don't really know what it looks like inside. But look, thankfully, the beauty of Bubble is that it is a visual tool. We need to remember that everything you do as the user is going to be a visual process. And so that means that creating a database is once again going to be completely visual. So when it comes to databases in Bubble, there are two core concepts you really need to understand. And this is the crux of absolutely everything you're going to do inside of Bubble. So if you take anything away from this entire course today, please let it be this. In Bubble, when you're creating a database, there's two key terms. There's a data type, and then there is a data field. Now, what on earth are these two terms, and why are they so important in Bubble? Look, when you're storing information inside of your database, a data type is going to be an overall thing. So it's known as an entity. And it's kind of pointless in me even saying the word entity because that probably just sounds like complete gibberish. So what I want to do is share a practical example of what a data type is. So in your application, let's say we're going to be creating something like an Instagram app today. So once again, a social media site where users can create accounts and upload content. When we're building out the database for that, it's important to first identify what are the actual things that users are going to create inside of our app. And when I think about that, I think that a user is going to need to register an account. So that's something they're going to create. They're also probably going to want to create Instagram posts. So whether that be a photo or a video, they might also create comments. So when they leave a comment on someone else's post, they're technically creating something. And so every time a user creates something, it's storing that information inside of our database. It's creating an entry. So when it comes to a database, it essentially is just like a big spreadsheet. There's a bunch of rows and columns, and every single time someone creates something, it's going to create a row inside of that spreadsheet. And so the data type is the overall thing that someone is going to create. And so on the left-hand side of your Bubble database, you'll see a list of your data types. So these are the overall entities. Now, as you'll notice, by default, there is a user data type that's already being created. It's not just my app that has this. Any Bubble app you create will automatically have this. Now, why is that the case? Because in Bubble, in order for a user to use your app, they need to sign up and register an account first. So that's why Bubble already pre-creates the user data type. You don't need to do this. Now, inside of each data type, this is where we can touch base on that second key term, which is the data fields. Now, what you might notice is that on the right-hand side here, we have this heading known as the fields for my user data type. So we've selected this user data type, and within this are the fields. Now, the fields are a bit more easy to understand. The fields are all of the information that sit within the overall type. So remember how I mentioned that when a user creates an account, we want to create a new entry inside of our database. And if that entry is just like a big spreadsheet and it's going to add a row, we need to store some information for each row that's been added. And the best way to describe this is that let's say when a user registers an account, what information do we want to store under each specific user? It might be things like their email, their passwords, their name, their profile photo, a bio, so like a description about their profile. It's all of that information that's going to sit under the overall data type. So this is where you can see and add all of the bits of information that you need to store. Now, by default, what you'll notice is that under our user data type, within our data fields here, there is already an email data field. So by default in Bubble, a user needs to actually sign up with an email and a password. So they've already taken the liberty of creating the email field for you. The password field does also exist, but just for privacy reasons, you don't see that in plain text here. Bubble does hide that, but I just assure you that you don't need to create a data field for that. So this is the start of a Bubble database. It's very basic at this point, and that's good. We don't want to overcomplicate things right now. But just to summarize, data types are the overall things that your users will create, and the data fields are the bits of information that are going to be stored for each entry in your database. So if I jump over to my Notion checklist, what I want to do is just tick off that we've finished walking through the difference between data types and data fields. And now is where I want to walk you through something like a live demo that explains how we can actually create database inside of Bubble. So what I'm going to do is open up this separate page here, which is currently blank. And this is a really good thought exercise I do before I create any app inside of Bubble. Before I even open the data tab and create my database here, what I actually do is map it out inside of Notion, my note-taking tool. So that way I know exactly what it's going to look like before I then add it into Bubble. And the reason for that is because if I make a mistake or I realize I could do things a better way, I don't need to delete and move things around inside of Bubble. I can just really take the time to think about doing it properly here. And once I'm happy with the final order of everything, I can then jump into Bubble and build that out. And it only takes a matter of minutes then. So let's say in my example today, if I was creating an Instagram database. Now I'm going to break this down into a bit of a simple example. We're not going to recreate the entire Instagram app. But the first thing I need to do is think about all of the data types that we need to add. Now, as I mentioned, when it comes to a data type, these are the things that your users are going to create from their profiles. So if we think hard about what our users are going to create, they obviously need to create their own account when they register. So this is that user data type that Bubble has already built. So I'm just going to write the word user here, and I'm actually just going to mark this up as a heading. And then below this heading, we're going to add in all of the data fields for that. But before we even touch the data fields, what I want to do is just think about all of the data types. And there is a very specific reason why I list all of my data types first, before I then go and add my data fields. And that's because some of the data fields will actually link to our separate data types. And I feel like I've already just said too much because that's very confusing right now. So don't worry about that. All you need to worry about right now is listing all of the things that your users will create inside of your app. So there is our user data type. Now, once a user has registered an account, they might want to create a post. So whether that be a photo or a video. So I'm just going to call this the post data type. I'm also going to highlight this and make it a heading. I'm then going to hit enter. And let's say if we put ourselves in our user's shoes, they might scroll through the feed on our homepage and they might want to leave a comment on a person's post. So whenever they type some text in and hit send, it's going to need to store that text in our database. So it's going to be creating something. So that's why a comment will need to be its own data type as well. So I'm going to type in the word comment. I'm going to set this as a heading. And look, for now, when it comes to our Instagram clone, this is actually all I'm going to add in. So I'm going to keep things pretty simple here. But what I want to now do is explain how we can actually build out all of the data fields. So what we need to do is first build out our user data type. So for this data field, I just need to identify what are the specific bits of information I want to store for every single user inside of our app. Now, what I like to do is add these as a checklist, so that way I can tick them off once I've added them into Bubble. But let's think hard about this. When a user creates an account, obviously we need their email and password, but that's already stored by default inside of Bubble. So I don't really need to add this out here. But what we do want to store is, let's say, a user's name. Now, if you wanted, you could have two separate fields here. One is the first name, one is the last name. I'm just going to make these a joint name. And then what I should also do is think hard about what type of data this is going to be. So if someone stores a name, that's just going to be stored as text inside of our database, isn't it? Because they're going to type a couple of characters, and then they're going to store that, and then we'll display that later on their profile. So what I'm also going to do is, in brackets, just type that I'd like to store this as text. Now this is important because later on when you create your data fields inside a Bubble, you have the ability to determine how you want to store particular information. So should it be stored as text? Should it be stored as an image? Should it be stored as a file? Should it be stored as a yes/no option? So there's lots of different ways you can store information. Information isn't always just text. It can be more than that. If someone wants to post a video, you need to store that video file inside of the data type. So for the name here, it's going to be text. The next thing I like to store is a person's handle or their username. So let's say we want everyone to have a unique username inside of our app. I'm going to create a field called handle. And look, this is going to be text. Once again, it's super straightforward. We might also want to store a profile photo for a user. So I'm going to type in the word profile photo. Now, one thing you might have noticed here is that when it comes to the spelling of this, I put a dash in between these two words, not a space. Now, look, this wasn't an accident. This was very intentional. So when it comes to my data fields, if I ever have two separate words, I like to separate them with a dash. And the reason for that is because later on, when I go to actually display that information, if I see a word with a dash in it, I know that is a data field. Whereas any words without dashes could potentially be my data types. Now, my data types here don't have multiple words, but there will be some cases where your data types are two separate words. And in that case, I would just separate those with a space. But anything that's a data field, I like to separate with a dash, so I know that it is in fact a data field. Now look, that isn't essential, but it's just going to make your life much easier down the track. Now for my profile photo, I'm going to say that this should be an image because obviously I want to store a photo here. Now, if you're not too sure how you should store this data field or what kind of information you're able to store in Bubble, what I'd recommend doing is just quickly trying to create a new data field here. And what you'll see is you can give the data field a name, but under here you've got a drop-down menu which is known as your field type. And this just displays all of the different types of information and ways you can store that data. So there's things like text, numbers, a range of numbers, date, that yes, no option, a file, an image, or an address, and there's a couple more there. But these are all of the different types of ways you can store data fields. So this is where I'm grabbing that list from. I should have explained that a little earlier, sorry. I'm not just grabbing these from thin air. I've actually calculated or looked at in Bubble what is the most relevant option. The next thing I might like to do is just store a user's bio. So a bio is just going to be their about text that we display on their profile. Now for a bio, that's just going to be a basic text field. But for the next two fields, this is where things are going to get a little interesting. Let's say I want to store a user's list of followers. So these are all of the people who have gone to this user's profile and selected to follow them. If I was to type in the word followers, that'll obviously create the title for the field. But what data field should we actually select here? I don't see a data field that allows me to reference a list of followers. But thankfully in Bubble, the solution is pretty straightforward. What you're able to do in Bubble, and this is where things get quite complex, is you can actually link your data fields to separate data types. Now, I only have one data type in the database at this point in time, and that is the default user data type. But if I was to create a field called followers, and look, you don't need to do this right now, I'm not actually going to create it, but I can set this field type to be a user. And what you'll also notice is we have this little checkbox to make this a list of multiple entries. So what I can now do is store a list of users under the followers field. So every single time someone goes to your profile on Instagram and chooses to follow you, I can add that person to that overall list of all of your followers. And this is the true power of Bubble's database. In technical terms, what you've just done is created a relational database. And look, it's kind of pointless in me saying that because for so damn long, that term confused the hell out of me. So I couldn't imagine how confusing that might be for you. But what it just means is that you can link all of your different data types together and create relations between all of the entities or the types inside of your database. So if we jump back to our Notion checklist here, I'm going to add in brackets that this should be a list of users. Now, the last thing I just want to store under our user data type for our data fields is just the list of people that someone follows. So this is going to be following. So let's say if I went to your profile and I followed you, we would need to add me to your list of followers, but we also need to add you to the list of people that I'm following. So once again, I'm going to make this a list of users. And I can see I just need to put a plural there. And that is all I'm going to add for the sake of our demo today. So under our user data type, I'm going to keep this pretty lightweight for now. The next thing we need to build out though is the post data type. So let's say we've got a user, they've got all of this information stored about them, And right now, what they need to do is create a post inside of our platform so we can populate our Instagram clone with some content. When it comes to this post here, let's say if it was just a basic image post, I'm not going to worry too much about creating, let's say, a video or a story at this point in time. We'll keep things pretty simple. But the first thing we need to store is the actual image of this post. So I'm going to create a new data field here, and this is going to be called the image. And in brackets, the type of data we're going to store is in fact an image. Then for the next field, when someone posts an image, they might also need to add a caption to it. So that's the beautiful little text that's going to go alongside it. So in this case, I'm going to create another field called caption. And for the caption, that's just going to be basic text. Now look, before I move on, I can just see I have a typo here, which is driving me insane. So I'm just going to fix that. But going back to the data fields, the last data field I want to add in is going to be the likes. So how many people have liked this particular post? Now look, there's a couple of different ways you can create likes in Bubble. And this is where I think a lot of people get overwhelmed when it comes to creating a database inside of Bubble. There's typically no right or wrong way to do things. There's always multiple different ways you can do one thing. So if I was to create a field called likes and open up my bracket here, let's jump into Bubble and see what kind of a field type we could use for likes. I've made the exact same typo. What we could do is store this as a number. So every single time someone hits the like button, we could add a count to that. So we could have 1 like, then 2 likes, then 3 likes, and then eventually hundreds of thousands of likes. But the problem with storing that as a number is that I wouldn't be able to see who the people are that actually liked that post. And that to me is probably the most important thing. Because if, let's say, I post something on Instagram and it gets 100 likes, you can bet your ass I want to go and see who all those people are that liked my post. We're humans and it's just what we do. So what I would actually do when it comes to the likes here, and this again is completely open to interpretation, I would store this once again as a list of users. So every single time someone likes that post, I'm going to add that person to the list of all of the people. And thankfully, what you can do in Bubble when you have a list is you can perform a count on that. And I'll explain that later on when we build out our actual app. But let's say I've added 100 people into this list. Bubble can easily quickly calculate how many people are in that list and then relay that information. So we can say there are 100 people in this list that have liked that post. And then when you click on that list, it'll open it up and then display all of those users to the person. So that way they can get their hit of dopamine when they see all of the people who have liked their post. So for me personally, I would store the likes as a list of users. And look, that's all I want to add into this data type for now. I'm going to keep it quite basic, although I will come back to this in a moment and just explain how we can optimize a couple of things. But before we do that, I just want to build out my very last data type, and that is my comment. So every single time someone creates a comment, we're going to store that in our database. Now, one thing I haven't actually mentioned, which is super important when it comes to creating data types, is that you'll notice here I haven't used plurals. And if you take another thing away from this tutorial, it's that you should never, ever, ever, ever use a plural on the name of your data type. Please don't be the person that does this. I see this quite frequently. And look, I can guarantee you that when I started using Bubble, I also added plurals on my data types. Now, why is this so important and why am I making such a big deal about it? I can completely understand when people are creating a database, they might think that they want comments to be created. Because of course, on your Instagram clone, you're going to be able to create more than one comment, or you would hope that people are going to create more than one comment in their lifetime on the app. So a lot of people come in and they say, hey, I want people to create comments. And look, you are technically right. You're going to create multiple comments over the course of your app's life. But at any given point in time, when a user writes a comment and posts it, they're writing a comment, not comments. They're only creating one entry in your database at a time. Now, users can write multiple comments. So let's say if you create a post, I go to it and it's such a fire post. I might hit you with a string of fire emojis. I'll create that comment. It'll then send that to our database and store that information in it. Then from there, I might say, you know what? Those fire emojis weren't enough. I want to add a string of the 100 emojis because I like this post so damn much. What I would do is add that comment in, hit send, and it would create another entry in my database. And so although I've created 2 comments, I've actually only created 1 at a time. And that is how Bubble works. Each user will only be able to create 1 entry at any given time. Now, of course, if you've got 1,000 users logged into your app and they all create a comment at the exact same time, that is perfectly fine. Bubble can process that. But this is just why you should never add a plural on the name of your data type. You can definitely do it for your data fields. So for things like the likes here, you can see I've added a plural because I'm storing a list of things. But when it comes to the data type, please don't add a plural. Now, moving on from my little rant there. For the comment here, what I'm going to actually want to store is the text of that comment. So I'm going to create a field, and look, I'm just going to call this the content of the comment. You could call this the text, the caption, the message, whatever you want. I personally just like to call it the content. And this is just going to be a text field. It's super basic. But the thing about this comment is that when I create this in my database, it's currently just going to be floating around in space on its own. Whereas what I need to do is link this comment to a particular post. So that way, when a user opens up that post and opens specifically the list of comments, they can see all of the comments that have been linked to that post. So how can we do that? Remember when I mentioned the term relational database, how I said you could connect your data fields to different data types? What I'm going to do is show you a demo of how we could do that again. So if we were to create a data field here, and look, I know this is under my user data type, not my comment, but bear with me. If I was to create this here, I would call this a comment. And what I could actually do is link this field type to my post. So let's pretend for a second this user data type is called post. What I could do is create that. And that means that every single time someone creates a comment, I'm going to link that back to the original post that they had published it on. And I'm not going to tick that this should be a list with multiple entries because a user doesn't comment on multiple posts at once. They only comment on 1 post at a time. So I would actually link this to my post data type. So what I like to do is create a separate data field, and I like to call this the OG post. Now in this use case, OG is not the original gangster. It is just the original. You could call this field the post, but I just like to call it the OG post. So I know that that is the original post that this comment was published against. And in this case, the field type is going to be my post data type because I want to link these 2 together. And then look, once we've added that in, that is all of the data fields I need to add under my comment data type. So that's pretty much everything I want to build out for my basic Instagram clone app. Although there is one very important lesson that I still need to run you through, and that is how we can optimize this application for speed. So in Bubble, there's something really important that you need to understand. When you search through your database for a list of items and you fetch those, Bubble is going to load every single data field that sits within that. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's say, for example, we have our Instagram clone on the homepage, which is the main feed that people look at all the content or all of the posts. Now, let's say we've got a list of 100 different posts. What Bubble's built to do is that it will load all of those 100 posts, but it's going to load absolutely every data field inside of each one of those posts. So not only are we loading 100 posts, but if we're loading 3 different data fields at once, that's 300 bits of information. Now, this is only a small data type. It only has 3 fields. Some data types might actually have 10 data fields or even 20 data fields. So if you're loading 100 posts with 20 data fields each, that's 2,000 bits of information, which is a lot for Bubble to load. And so this is where your application might start to slow down because you're loading every single data field, even if you don't need to display it. So let's say, for instance, I don't want to display my images on all of my posts. I just want to display the caption. And then if someone clicks on that caption, it should take them through and display that image. Even though I don't want to display this image straight away, doesn't matter. Bubble's still going to load that image. So what we need to do is actually split off all of the data fields we don't need immediately and store them in what's known as a satellite data type. And I use quotations here because that is another fancy buzzword that I completely understand, probably sounds like gibberish. But the best way to explain what a satellite data type is by using a great example with my fists here. So let's say over here in this list is my post data type. It's in my database. Now inside of this data type are these three data fields. So there's my image, there's my caption, and then there's my likes. Now things like the caption, which are just basic text, will load super quickly. Text doesn't really take that long for Bubble to load because it's not very heavyweight. If you want to look at how many megabytes text is, it's super small. However, things like image, which is an image file, can often be quite large. If let's say it's 5 megabytes and you multiply that by 100, you've got 500 megabytes of data that you need to load, which is quite a bit. So what we can actually do is break this image off and store it in a satellite data type. So we'd have another data type that just floats around here in space, which is where the term satellite comes from. Now, what we would do is actually create a link between my main data type and my satellite. So that way they're still kind of tied together, kind of like how you've got a string on a kite. And maybe I've just coined a new term. They should call it a kite data type. But what this just means is that when we actually do want to display the image here for this post, we can send a message that says, hey, satellite up there, can you send me this image now that I need it? And this satellite will ping, it will return, and it will display that image now that you need it. But it will only load that image because you've specifically called it or referenced it. And so that means if we were to take this image away, when Bubble loads our posts, it's now not loading this image data field. So it's going to make sure our application is fast because it's not trying to load 100 different images at once, which is a lot of data. So what you can actually do is create a separate data type, which is a satellite. So I'm going to create a heading here, and I'm going to call this post satellite. And I just have a typo there. I definitely do not want a plural there, as I've mentioned before. But what I'm going to do here is store my image field under my post satellite. And then to replace that image field in my post, what I'm going to do is create a separate field, and I'm going to call this the satellite data. And this field, for the type of it, is going to be linked to my post satellite field. So I'm just going to quickly type this in. And then any of the larger information that we don't need to display immediately, or that is a very large file, is going to be stored within my satellite. And then whenever I display my posts, I can reference the image stored within it there. So this is a very essential and important thing to know when you're creating a database inside a Bubble. It's just going to help you optimize your app for longevity and speed. Now look, at this point, I'm pretty happy with everything we've mapped out inside of our database. So what we need to do is actually jump into Bubble and build this out. So I'm going to do this super quickly here. But thankfully, as I mentioned before, because we've taken the time to sit down and think about everything in more detail, the process of actually creating this inside a Bubble is going to be super straightforward. So the first thing you need to do is add in all of your data types. So on the left-hand side here, we need to add in our post. There was our post satellite, and then there was a comment. So now we have all of our 4 data types. Super straightforward. Now from here, we can add in all of the fields under each data type. So for our user, we're going to open this up. We're going to create a field. And the first field was the name of the user. And this field type was text. I'll create that. We can jump back into Notion. I could check that off. Then there was the handle, the profile photo, and the bio. So if we jump back into Bubble, I'm going to create a new field called the handle. This was once again a basic text field. Super straightforward. Then there was the profile photo, remembering that I like to separate the words in my data fields with a dash. And this field type is going to be an image. So I'll scroll down, select that, and choose to create this. And then for the remaining fields, there was the followers and there was the list of following. So if I jump into Bubble, I'm going to create a field called followers. And this field type will be a list of users, as I had explained before. So I'll create this, then we'll add another one for the following. And this field type will once again reference our user data type, and we'll select that that should be a list with multiple entries. And just like that, that is all of the data fields we need to add for our user data type. So you can see what I mean about how quickly it actually is to build out the database once you've taken the time to do all of the heavy lifting here. Most of the time you'll spend actually building your database is just the thought process of mapping everything out. The process of actually building it in Bubble takes probably a couple minutes. So for our next data type, we've got our post. So if we jump into Bubble, I'm going to open this up. And for every single post, there was the caption. And this field type was text. I'll create that. Then for the next field, there was the likes, which once again, this field type was a list of users. I'll create that there. And then for the final field, there was our satellite data. So we're going to create a link here. We'll call this the satellite data. And this field type will reference our post satellite. Now, this is kind of a good example as to why I add the dash between my data field, but not in my data type. As you can see, I'm not going to get confused here because my post satellite, although it kind of looks the same as my satellite data field, the data type has a space, whereas I know for a fact my data field has a dash. So I just know which is which. Now, this is not a list with multiple entries because I only want my satellite data to link to one satellite out in space. I don't want it to link to multiple, so I'm going to create that there. And that is all of the data fields under my post, but we need to go and build out that post satellite. So I'm going to jump over to my post satellite, and in this is just my image, and this field type is just going to be an image file. I'll create that there. And then finally, the very last thing was the comment. So if we jump to our comment data type, there was the actual content of the comment, which was just the text. That's super basic. But then there was the OG post. So the original post that this comment belongs to. I'm going to link this to my post data type. And once again, this is not a list with multiple entries, so we will not be checking this. We only want one comment to link to one post. And just like that, we now have a fully functional database that has been built out inside of Bubble. The very last thing I want to cover inside of my checklist here is just this point where I want to show you how you can view data that's stored inside of your database. So at this point in time, I don't actually have any real user data stored inside of this database because we haven't actually built or launched the app. But in your data tab here, what you'll notice at the top is a bit of a menu. There's the data types, but what I'm interested in showing you is the app data. So do you remember before how I mentioned that a database just looks like a big spreadsheet with rows? This is essentially that. So this is where you can view all of the information that has been created and stored in your app's database. So let's say under our user data type here, Bubble will display a list of all of the users that have created accounts. And for every single row or entry you'll see, you can look at all of the information for each user. So there's their email, there's the people that they follow, there's their handle, there's their name. And look, you can manually create entries if you'd like, and you can also edit that information as well. So what I might do is quickly just run you through that. So if we wanted to create a new entry, now look, obviously in your Instagram app, you would have a proper registration page that users could add all of this information in. But what I'm interested in doing today is just showing you how you as the admin of your app could also manually create data. What I'm going to do is just add in all of this information. So I'm just going to say that my email is test@gmail.com. My name is Lachlan Kirkwood. I will have the handle Lachlan Kirkwood. I don't need to add any people that I follow or followers myself because there are no users at this point in time. I will add a profile photo. And finally for the slug, I don't really need to change that. The slug is essentially just how your profile will be displayed in the URL. But look, that's a topic for another module. What I'm going to do is create this entry here. And once that has been successfully created, you'll be able to see that row inside of your database. So now you have real information stored that you can view. So for this user, I can see their email, I can see their handle, their name, and their profile photo. And of course, it's only you as the admin of your app that can see this. Your users won't be able to see this. But what you can also do is edit that information. So let's say I want to change my handle to Lachlan_Kirkwood. I can do that and click save. And that will automatically update there and be reflected inside of our database, which also just means that on my user profile, that information would also be reflected. So look, that is everything I want to cover inside of this database module. I feel like I've been talking for so long at this point, and I probably overwhelmed you with a lot of different terms and topics. So all we're going to do is just tick off that we've finished adding everything in, and that's a wrap for this section of our course today. Inside of this module, we're going to start diving into everything you need to know about designing the actual user interface of your Bubble app. Now look, I'm going to break this down into a couple of different modules. And within this specific module, I'm just going to start by giving you an overview of how you can actually use Bubble's responsive application editor. So this just explains how you can design fully responsive apps that will work across both mobile and desktops. Now look, there's plenty to cover, so let's just jump right into it. Working our way through my list of topics that I want to cover within our course today, the next thing we're going to focus on is actually quite a large section, and that is learning how we can understand designing actual pages and elements inside of Bubble. Now this will also cover how to create fully responsive experiences across both mobile and desktop devices. And look, as you can see within this section, I've actually broken this down into a couple of different videos. And the reason for that is because there is just so much that I need to cover. What I want to do is make this easier to understand by putting it into bite-sized pieces. And so within this particular section of our video today, I just want to start by giving you a brief overview of the Flexbox responsive engine inside of Bubble. Now, the past three words I said, Flexbox responsive engine, are probably just complete gibberish to you, and that is completely fine. Essentially, what this just means in simple terms is Flexbox is a design style which actually comes from the coding world, particularly CSS. But thankfully, you don't need to write a single line of code or CSS or HTML. Bubble has a completely visual way of creating fully responsive apps across any device. And in my opinion, it is super easy to do. So what I want to do is just jump over into a brand new Bubble editor here and explain to you a couple of key concepts you need to understand. So in my Bubble editor, I have a blank page here. Now you might notice that this page is called my index page. So in the top left-hand corner, Bubble has the page drop-down menu. So when you open this, you can see a list of all of the default pages that have been created inside of your app. And you can go on to create new pages as well. And this is where you can jump between all of the different pages. So for instance, Bubble provides us with a 404 page. They provide us with a password reset page and something called the index page. So the index page in Bubble is just the home page of your app. So when people open your application, this is the page they're going to come to. And as you can see, at this point in time, my entire page is blank. Now, if I was to double click on this page, what you'll notice is that this little toolbox here is going to pop up. This is called the property editor, because this is where you're going to be able to edit all of the properties of all of the elements and items that you add onto your page. And this property editor has three different tabs within it. Now look, you can drag it around wherever you want, but the first tab is the appearance tab. So this is where you can see all of the design settings for the element that you've selected. So in this case, I've selected my overall index page here, which I can see in my property editor, I've selected the index page. You can also update the name of any elements by just selecting here. So you could change the name of this. You could add in any word you'd want. However, if I go to do this just on the index page, you'll see I get an error message. And the reason I can't do this is because the index page actually needs to be called the index page. But any other page or element, you can change the name of it. And this is where you do just that. You can also update things like the background style, the border colors. So anything related to the actual design of the element you've selected is within this appearance tab. Then there's what's known as the layout tab. And this is going to be absolutely essential for what I'm about to teach you today. When it comes to creating fully responsive experiences across any device size, the layout tab is exactly where you're going to do this. So the layout tab determines the layout of all of the elements on your page. And within this module, we're going to spend quite a bit of time here. But before I explain this, I just want to quickly open up the third tab, which is called the conditional tab. Now, I'm not going to go too in depth on the conditional tab because I have a dedicated section in our course today, which covers conditions in full detail. But conditions, essentially as the name suggests, just allows you to change the behavior of the element you've selected based on a series of conditions. So you could say, hey, if the user's logged out, I want to display a message on the page that says you should log in. And then you could create another condition which just recognizes if, let's say, the user is logged in, you could display a message that prompts them to log out. So these are the 3 tabs within our overall property editor. But what I want to do right now is open up our layout tab once again, because as I mentioned, when it comes to building a responsive application, this is where you're going to spend 90% of your time. So within our layout tab, you're going to see this drop-down menu, which is known as the container layout. Now, the word container used to actually confuse the hell out of me all of the time, but an easy way to interpret this is to just think of your overall page like a Tupperware container. So if this is one big giant container right now, anything we add into it is going to be stored within that container. So anytime I add a button or an image or something like a map onto my page, it sits within this overall container because the page contains all of those elements and items. And so that's where the name container comes from. And you're going to hear that many times throughout Bubble. So all you just need to understand is a container is called that because it contains items. Now, next to the container layout, you'll see a drop-down menu, which when you open this, it has 4 different options. So what on earth is a container layout? The container layout will just determine the order in which elements are positioned across your page. Now, there's 4 options here, but please don't get overwhelmed. I only ever use 2 of these options, and that is the row or the column. So what on earth is the difference between the 2? What I've done is I've actually created a quick illustration of this in just a separate image here. But essentially, between the column and the row options, what they do is just give you control over how you can stack different elements on your page. So let's say we added 2 elements onto our page, and for this sake, we could say it's 2 buttons. If I was to want these buttons to be stacked on top of each other, I would need to select the column option. So the column option just says, on this page, all of my elements should be stacked from top down. Whereas with the row option, it does the exact opposite. It says all of my elements should be stacked across my page. So a column is when you stack things vertically, whereas a row is where you stack things horizontally. And I think the best way to illustrate this is by just showing you that real world example. So if I was to add 2 buttons onto my page, at this point, my page has no container layout. It's this fixed option, which, side note, you should never use the fixed option. What the fixed option means is you can just drag these wherever you want on your page, which might seem like it's quite easy to design elements exactly where you want them. But if we were to view this in the responsive editor, so over here we can open up our responsive view. And as you'll see, this page here is currently a fixed layout, which means it is not responsive, which is why Bubble's prompting us to make this responsive. So what we could do is select on our page. So if you double click on the overall white element here, you could open up your layout tab and let's try and set this as the column container layout. And keep an eye on what happens to my 2 buttons here. When I click this, these are now stacked perfectly on top of each other. So they are stacked vertically from top down. Whereas let's say if I was to set the container layout to be a row, these are now stacked horizontally across my page. So you can see the difference between the 2. And that's why I only ever select one of the 2 options. So I'll either choose the row or the column. Now, when it comes to the container layout of your overall page, 9 times out of 10, it should always be a column. Because when you think of a modern application, everything is built from the top down. Although there might be elements that scale across the width of your page, everything sits top down. And perhaps the best way to illustrate this is just by showing you an example of my own website. So on this page here, what I can see is that there are in fact many elements. And while there are some elements that are scaled horizontally across my page, the overall structure of the page is set as a column. Because at the top, we have this menu. Then sitting below that, we have this section, which has elements positioned side by side. Then below that, we have another section. Then below this, we have some text. So everything on the page is actually scaled from top down. But don't worry, I will explain how we can make elements positioned across our page. And the way in which you can do that is by using what's known as group elements. So right now, if I was to make my overall page container layout a column, but I wanted these 2 buttons to be positioned side by side, I can't really do that Because if I change the container layout of my overall page to a row, I obviously get the experience I'm looking for with my buttons. But now my overall page container layout is a row. It's not that column which we need. So if this is set to a column, how can I make just one section of my page set as a row? Thankfully, there is a specific element that allows you to do this. And look, later on throughout another section of this video today, I'm going to explain what all of these different elements are. But I'm just going to quickly jump ahead for now because there's one element I need to show you. So if we scroll on down, there's a section here known as the container elements. And there's that C word again, container. And inside of this, there's an element known as a group. So if I add this group onto my page, right now it just looks like a small square. And look, that's completely fine. But a group is essentially another container that you can add onto your page. And if you had told me that exact sentence when I'd first started Bubble, I would have been so confused. So in simple terms, a group is like a mini page that you add into your overall page. So it's a container within a container. You can kind of think of it like one of those little Russian dolls where you open it up and there's another little doll sitting inside of it. And when you need to create a fully responsive experience inside of your Bubble app, this is exactly how you do it. So you stack multiple different groups based on how you want the layout of your page to look. So for this group here, if we want to put these two elements in it, so the two buttons, and we want them to stack horizontally across our page, we just need to take care of some housekeeping. And while we do this, it's going to allow me to explain a lot of core concepts to you about how we can create a fully responsive experience. So the first thing I typically do when I'm working with this group is give it a name. So I'm just going to call this group row because inside of this, I want to set the container layout to be a row so I can stack all of my buttons side by side. Now, as you noticed, similar to the overall page, you can update the name of this element at the top of your property editor. Now, by default, the container layout of a group here will always be set to a column. Whereas what I want to do is set this as a row. And as you can see, a group has all of these same property settings as the overall page. So to my point again, a group is kind of like a page within a page. Now, for the sake of my tutorial and whenever I actually build out my application, what I like to do is quickly just jump over to my appearance tab and just give this group a background color. Because if I was to click away right now, I can't actually see where my group is on the page. It's kind of like I've almost forgotten where it is. So what I'm going to do is select on the group, and this is just a personal preference of mine. I like to color code my groups while I'm building my app. So in my appearance tab, where I can update the look of this group, I'm going to head to my style here and just attach the default style. And it's going to give me the option to update the background style, and I'm going to make it a flat color. And I might make it something like a light shade of red. And when I color code my groups, it kind of makes me feel like I'm just building with Lego blocks because I've got all of these colorful blocks that I can stack on top of each other and create the experience I'm looking for. But the beautiful thing about this is when you go to publish your application, obviously you don't want your users to see this massive giant rainbow cake of colors. So what you can just do is remove the background style back to none, and it will remove the color of that group. But for now, I just want to keep this as red so you can clearly see where it sits on my page when I click away from it. Now, the next thing you need to do before you can add your elements into this group is obviously increase the size of it. So right now, this button ain't fitting inside that group. I can tell you that. So what we need to do is go over to our layout tab again because we need to update the layout of this group. And I want to make this group fully responsive across the full width of my page. So what we need to do is head on down to the width and the height settings of this group. And what you'll see is that under both your width and your height, you have these settings called the minimum and the maximum. So the minimum will determine how many pixels this group will shrink down to. And right now it's set at 40 pixels. So this is that small size you see there. That is 40 pixels across your page. Whereas I can also see that it has an infinite maximum width. So in theory, this group should be able to increase to the largest possible size. But why isn't it doing that? Because we also have this option ticked by default here to fit the width of this group to the content inside of it. Now there is technically no content inside of this group. And by content, what Bubble just means is you could add, let's say, this button into that group. And perhaps I should do that. If I was to drag this button into the group, which I don't think is going to happen, maybe I could go and put a new button into that group. Perfect. what you'll now see is that that group has expanded out to the size of this button. But now we can't really see the group. So what I'm going to do is just remove that. But what I'm just getting at here is that this option is not really what we're looking for right now. We don't want this group to fit to the width of content inside of it. Now, there are specific use cases where you'd want to do that, but it's not really too common. So what I'm going to do is uncheck this option and have a look at just what happened there. So once I unselected this red group now automatically spans across the full width of my page. And this is where we can start to create that truly responsive experience. So when it comes to creating a responsive group or a responsive page, it's important to set the minimum width to 0 pixels and the maximum width to infinite. Now, why is that important? When you think about it, when the minimum width is 0, it means that this group can shrink down to the smallest possible size, which is nothing. It's 0 pixels. And when the maximum width is infinite, it means that it's going to continually span across my page, regardless of how big the page is. Now, if I jump over to my responsive tab, and look, I should have given you more of an overview of this earlier on, but this is what your application is going to look like across any device size. So you can, let's say, drag this out, you can shrink this down, and if you wanted, Bubble has some pre-built dimensions for you. So you can see what this looks like on a desktop, on a tablet, and even on a phone at the smallest possible size. And what you might notice here is that regardless of what size my page is, this red group is fully responsive. So it either expands out or it shrinks down to a mobile device here. And so what we've done is we've created a fully responsive experience. So when it comes to creating that responsive experience, these are the exact settings you will use time and time again inside of Bubble. Normally in my tutorials, I sound like a broken record explaining that you have to set your minimum width to 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. But look, these settings here are going to be your best friend. You can create a fully responsive app with just this. Now watch what happens when we add these button elements into our group. And look, I might just add some new buttons in because it's kind of hard to drag those into my group. But if I was to drag 2 buttons into my red group here, we now have a section on our page which scales horizontally. So across the landscape of our page. And what's crazy is that on top of that, we have 2 elements that are stacked vertically. So you can kind of think of this like the website I'd shown you before. So at the top, you've got this menu, and below that, you've got this section that is scaled horizontally across your page. So this would kind of be like the 2 buttons that we've just added in. So even though our overall page has the container layout of a column, which if you remember, means that elements will be positioned from the top down, we're able to add this section here, which is going to be scaled horizontally as a row. So elements in this will be positioned side by side. And when it comes to building any page inside of Bubble, this is what it's going to look like. You're going to need to add multiple different groups onto your page to stack them in order to get the exact experience you want. And so over in a separate Bubble editor, this is an example of a page that I've previously created. So what you'll notice is that on this page, there are many different colors, and every color you see here is an individual group. So let's break this down quickly. On my overall page, so when I double click on this, this is a user profile page, which is what I've called it. The container layout is set as a column because at the top here, I have this navigation menu or a search menu in this case. And then below that, I have all of the content on my page. But when it came to my profile page, I wanted to split this down into 2 separate sections that are positioned side by side. So on the left-hand side, this would display a user's profile photo as well as their name and their bio. And then on the right-hand side, this displays a list of content that this user has published. So in this application, I built a Yelp clone, which displays a list of reviews. So what you can see here is that within my overall page, I had to add this purple group, which has the container layout set as a row because I wanted to position 2 elements side by side. Then what I'd done is I'd added a white group, which is my profile details, onto the left-hand side of my page, which is within that purple group. And the container layout of this group is set as a column because inside of this group, I wanted to stack elements on top of each other. I wanted these to be positioned vertically. Then over on the right-hand side, I've added this green group into my page, which displays a list of reviews that someone has created. And all of this information is stacked vertically, so everything's on top of each other. So once again, the container layout here is a column, but inside of that, I wanted to display some elements side by side. So I wanted to display a picture next to some text, which means that if I wanted to make this container layout a row, I had to add another group inside of this. So this red group is separate to my green group. Although it sits inside of my green group, the container layout for this is a row, which means that I could stack these elements side by side. Now, I know this might seem confusing if you are brand new to Bubble. It seems like a lot of work, but trust me, when you're building your application, it feels very intuitive. As I mentioned before, the best metaphor I can think of when it comes to creating responsive pages inside of Bubble is that when you color code them, it kind of feels like you're just stacking Lego bricks on top of each other. And look, before we wrap up this section of our video today, there is another important concept that I just need to introduce. And look, thankfully, this is going to actually help make your life a lot easier. And that is the concept of margin and padding. And I think the best way to illustrate this is to just show you how we can actually build out a proper page. So what I'm going to do is delete all of my elements on this page here. And let's say we want to create a page that has a similar experience to my website, where we've got this section here on the left and this section here on the right. What I'm going to do is go ahead and build that. So right now, if I had my overall page where the container layout is a column, what I'd need to do in order to create two sections that sit side by side is obviously add a group onto my page and set its container layout as a row. So let's go and do that. Let's add a group on my page. I'm going to call this the main group. I'm going to, first of all, update the color of this. So over in my Appearance tab, I'm going to detach the default style and set the background style to be a flat color and make that a shade of red. And look, if you're at home watching this, feel free to follow along. I think this will give you a really good idea of how you can start to get the feel for building out a page. We're then going to need to make this group span across the full width of my page. So let's jump over to my layout tab and let's make this fully responsive. So the minimum width should be 0. The maximum width should be infinite, which it is by default. And we will need to uncheck this box to fit the width of this element to any content inside of it. Now, something else that I didn't touch base on before is the height of an element. So the height is similar to the width, although when it comes to creating a fully responsive experience, the height isn't as important as the width. However, right now I can see that this group has a minimum height of 40 pixels. So this is this exact height that you see here. And once again, by default, it has this option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it. So if you ever wanted to create a fully responsive experience from a vertical perspective, what you would do is obviously add all of your elements inside of this. Then similar to the width settings, you could set the minimum height to be 0, leaving the maximum height as infinite. But because we have this option checked to fit the height to the content inside of this, and there is no content inside of this, it just makes it pretty much null and void. So what I want to do is unselect this. And now this is going to take up the entire height of my page, which is probably a bit too much. So if I wanted to play around with this, let's say I could give it a maximum height of 500 pixels. Now there's no scientific reason why I selected 500. I just think that that's enough space to show you the example I'm trying to create today. But the most important thing we need to remember is that the container layout here needs to be a row, not a column, because I want to stack two elements side by side. So what I'd now like to do is add both of these sections onto my page. So how can I do that? What I can see is that within each section, it contains a couple of different elements. So the section on the left has a couple of different text elements and some buttons. And from what I can see, these elements are stacked vertically, so they're on top of each other, which means that when I add a group to this side of the page, the container layout needs to be a column. So if I jump back into my Bubble editor, what I'm going to do is add both of these groups into my red group. And I might just start with the left group. So I'm going to call this group left. The first thing I'll do is jump to my Appearance tab and once again just update the background style of this. So for the background style, I'll make this a flat color and I'll make this, let's say, a shade of green. I'll then update the responsive settings. So if I head to my Layout tab, I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0. And like always, I'm going to make the maximum width infinite. I'm going to uncheck that default option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And what you'll now see is that it will scale across the full width of my page. Now, for the sake of my tutorial, I am just going to increase the height of this. And so what I'm going to do is set the minimum height here to be, let's say, 300 pixels. Now, the only reason I did this is because I just want this to take up a bit more space on my page so you can clearly see where it is. But now beside this, we need to add another group. But I should quickly also just point out that you might see the container layout of our green group is set as a column because, as I mentioned, inside of this, we're going to be stacking elements from top down. So in order to add the next group in, I could manually just grab another group, or I could just select to copy this group here. So when I select this, you can just hit Control C, or if you're on a Mac like me, you can hit Command C. Select in your red group, so this is our group main, and then I'm just going to hit Command V. So I'm going to paste in another version of this group. Now, as you'll see, this is called the group left copy. So what I'm going to do is update the name of this and call this group right. And I'm also just going to head to my appearance tab and update the color of this. I might make this a shade of kind of blue or purple there. And so right now you can see that this page is coming together. So we have two separate groups here, and these are both taking up an even amount of space on our page. So because both of these groups have a minimum width of 0 and a maximum width of infinite, they're both fighting to try and take up as much space as they can across our page. Because once again, the maximum width is infinite. But because these sit side by side, they're automatically just going to take up the same amount of space regardless of how big or small the page is. So let's quickly just jump over to my responsive tab here. And what you'll see is that as we expand our page out, these groups will continually take up the exact same amount of space. And if I shrink the page down, these will shrink down to the smallest possible size, which is 0 pixels. But at any given point in time, they're going to take up the exact same amount of space. Now, there are a few additional responsive settings that I'm going to point out in a moment, but before we do that, what I'd like to do is actually add some elements inside of this. Now, later on throughout my tutorial, I was going to explain what all of these dedicated elements are, but for the sake of my tutorial today, I'm just going to add another button into my group here, and I'm just going to say on this button, sign up. So I'm going to update the text of this. But as you'll see, this button sits inside of the left-hand side of my page because it's within my green group. So if this green group is a container, it sits directly inside of that. And look, if I was to add something like a text element, because the container layout of my green group here is set as a column, these are going to be stacked vertically on top of each other. So perhaps I could even put my text above my button there. But if I click away, as you'll see, all of these elements are quite squished into the top left-hand corner of my group. And so this is where the power of margins comes into play. If I want to push these elements further down my page or further into my group, what we can do is add some margin onto it. And so before I do that, maybe I should even just update this text to say this is a heading. I'll just fix the typo there. And now if I jump over to my layout tab and scroll right down to the bottom, you're going to see these two settings known as margins and padding. Now look, if you've used any previous web building tool like Webflow, WordPress, Squarespace, or anything in between, you're probably already familiar with margins and padding. But if you're brand new to Bubble, margins and padding are going to be your best friend for creating responsive experiences. Margins essentially just allow you to add space around all of your elements. So let's say if I wanted to add a top margin of 20 pixels, as you can see, it's going to push this element down 20 pixels inside of my green group. Then if I was to add a margin of 20 pixels on the left and 20 pixels on the right, it'll just make sure that this text element never touches the borders of my green group. So if I jump into my responsive tab now and try to reduce the width of my page here, what you'll see is that this text will never touch the border of my green group. So this is how you can really start to control the position of all of your elements that sit inside of your containers. Now, there's a couple of other things I should point out here. What you might have noticed is that I didn't add a bottom margin on this element. And the reason for that is because my personal preference when I'm working with margins is that I like to just ensure some consistency between where I add those margins. And my personal preference is that I'll never add a bottom margin. Instead, I'll always make sure every element has a top margin. So if I grab the margins for this button and set it once again to be 20, 20 on the left and 20 on the right, I just know that this space between these two elements is created on the top margin of my button, not the bottom margin of my text. So it just allows me to easily identify where particular spaces sit or where they've been created for each of my elements there. So that's how you can use margins. And look, 9 times out of 10, I'm a margins guy, but there's also an option here known as padding. And so what's the difference between margins and padding? Look, I'm not gonna lie, when I first started with Bubble, for some reason, I just could not wrap my head around what padding was and why it was useful, but it definitely has its purpose. So if margins allow you to add space on the external border of your element, and the element being my text here, padding is the inverse option of that. It allows you to add space internally. So if I was to just remove all of my margins here, another way I could create space is by adding 20 pixels of padding around the exact same borders. But as you'll now see, between the border of my element, all that space has been added internally. Now look, technically it does look the exact same. It creates the same experience as what margins would do. But I just think from an internal building perspective, this kind of looks a little bit more confusing to me personally than if I was to use margins. So personally, I'm more of a margins guy myself. So for the sake of my tutorial today, what I'm going to do is just remove all of these padding and I'm going to add that back onto my margins. And before we wrap up here, we've pretty much covered everything I want. There is one last very, very, very important concept that I need to explain to you. And that is how you can truly create the best responsive experience on mobile devices. So remember how I mentioned to you that when you want to create a responsive experience, you should always set the width settings to be a minimum of 0 and a maximum of infinite. So that way your group can take up as little or as much space as possible on your page. There is one catch to this. When I expand this page out to be the entire width of something like a desktop, everything looks great. It's happy days. Both of my elements have plenty of room to take up as much space as they would like. But when we start to reduce the width to things like an iPad, or even more specifically, something like a mobile, as you can see here, my groups don't really have much space to display much content. Now, while this doesn't look too bad because all of these elements are quite small, what would happen if I was to expand this text out? So if I just paste in a bunch of text here, this looks absolutely terrible. Everything is very squished and it just doesn't really have enough room to breathe on my page. And the reason for that is because both of these elements have the minimum width of 0, which means they're going to shrink down to the smallest possible size, which once again does allow me to create that fully responsive experience. But the catch is that they just get too small when you're looking at something on a mobile device. So how can we create an experience that instead of shrinking these groups down to the smallest possible size, instead allows us to actually stack these two groups on top of each other? So that way, when you're on a mobile device, this green group can take up the entire width of the page, and the purple group can also take up the entire width, but it would be stacked below that green group. Look, thankfully, there is a super straightforward way to do this. In Bubble, what you might notice is that the mobile device size here is 320 pixels. Now, 320 pixels is the smallest possible device size that someone could view your application on. Most mobile devices, so something like an iPhone 16, they usually sit around 380 to 420 pixels in width. But if you have any users of your app that are currently sitting in the Stone Age with something like an iPhone 5, the width size of that is 320 pixels. So what Bubble does is it caters the experience to the smallest possible device that someone could view your app on. So that's 320 pixels. So given that we know that this is the smallest possible size, what we can do is cater an experience to that. So if I click on my green group here and open up my layout tab, at this point in time, again, I sound like a broken record, but it is fully responsive. The minimum width is 0, meaning it will shrink down to the smallest possible size. But what if we were to tell this group, hey, I don't want you to get any smaller than 320 pixels? Watch what's going to happen here. When I set the minimum width to be 320, this group becomes somewhat stubborn. It says, hey, you know what? I'm going to take up 320 pixels and I'm not going to get any smaller than that. So right now it's going to take up the perfect amount of width on our mobile device. But what I can see is that our purple group is now missing. And the reason for that is because our purple group currently has a minimum width set as 0. So it's happy to shrink down to absolutely nothing. So we need to make this group a little stubborn as well. So I'm going to set the minimum width of this group to also be 320 pixels. And now you'll see that they stack perfectly on top of each other. And watch what's going to happen when I expand my page out. So when there's enough room for both of these groups to be positioned side by side, they're going to do that in harmony. However, when we shrink the width of our page, and in theory, when we get to 640 pixels of our page, so right here is where you can tell how many pixels your page is, and you can see that this will update in real time. But when we get to 640 pixels, which is 320 plus 320, these groups should both get quite stubborn. And when they're not willing to budge, they should stack on top of each other. So when I reduce the width of my page, 640 is coming up here, boom, there it is. You can see that right now we have a fully responsive experience. So just by calculating a simple bit of math, so by recognizing that 320 plus 320 is 640, Bubble's able to take care of all of the heavy lifting for us and create a fully responsive experience. So now our text has plenty of space to display all of this long content, and it'll be the same for whatever is positioned inside of your blue group here. Now look, I've rambled on for long enough here. I hope this helps you understand the basic principles of building responsive applications inside of Bubble. I definitely recommend you play around with some different groups, adding different elements into them, and just seeing how you can stack different containers on top of each other to create some sort of page design that you're looking for. But right now, what I'm going to do is just jump back into my Notion checklist and tick off that we've finished covering the very first section of the page design module. Throughout this module, I'm going to walk through all of the different types of elements you can use and add into your Bubble app. And these are the things that your users are actually going to see and interact with as they use your application. As we're on the topic of all things design and elements inside of Bubble, one thing I just wanted to do was take a quick moment to talk about all of the different types of elements you can actually use to build your application and bring it to life. Now look, I kind of touched base on this in my previous section of this course where I gave you a bit of an overview into creating responsive apps using Bubble. But I just wanted to dive into this with a little bit more detail because there is a few more specific things you need to know. So if we jump over into our Bubble editor, on the left-hand side under your UI builder, you'll notice that this is where all of your potential elements lie. And look, these are broken down into a couple of different sections. At the top, there's things known as your visual elements. So these are all of the things that you can actually show and display to users on your page. So these are things like text, buttons, icons, images, or even things like maps. Now, obviously, the elements you use will be dependent on the type of application you're trying to build, but it's pretty common to use all of these elements whenever you're building your Bubble application. Now, one thing I would like to point out when it comes to particularly the text element or even something like an image element is that you have the ability to not only just add static text onto your page, and by static text, I mean text that's not going to change. So I could add a text element on my page and say something like this is a heading. But inside of Bubble, you also have the ability to create dynamic text. And there's that D word again, dynamic. So what does dynamic mean? Dynamic means it will alter and change the text based on any particular data you have stored in your database. So every person that uses your app will have a dynamic experience. It's not going to be the same old text that's going to be displayed. It's going to be specific text which reflects their version of the app that they should see and use. So if I was to add another text element onto my page, you'll see that when it comes to text elements, you have the ability here to insert dynamic data. And this is where you're going to see the true power of Bubble come to life. So when I do this, you have the ability to pull data from your database. And because your database is actually built directly inside of Bubble, it's super easy to access and pull information at any given point in time. Now, why on earth would you want to insert dynamic data in the first place? Let's say, for instance, if you built out a user's profile page, and on that page, you want to display the name of the person whose profile you're viewing. And for instance, in your app, if you had 1,000 registered users, instead of having to manually create 1,000 different pages, one for every single person, and write the static heading time and time again, What you can do is just create one page with one text element, and you can add dynamic data in, which will change the name based on the person whose profile you're viewing. Now look, there's so many ways in which you can use dynamic data. The possibilities truly are endless. You have the ability to search through your database for any data you would like. So based on the data types you have, you can pull any information and display any of its data fields. Now look, I'm not going to overcomplicate things right now, but what I would just like to show you is a very simple way in which you can use dynamic data. So if we insert dynamic data, you'll see the option to reference the current user. So the current user is the person who is logged into your app at any given point in time. So let's say you had 1,000 different users inside of your app. Each user would be the current user to themselves. And if you wanted to display their name, what you could do is reference the data of the current user. And in my database, I've taken the time to build out some data fields under my user data type here. And one of these fields is the name, which is a text field. And because I'm using a text element, I can display this user's name at any given point in time. So if I was to head to my design tab here, and if I display the current user, I'll now see a list of all of the data fields in which I can reference information from. And I'm just going to choose to display their name. Now here's the cool thing. If I was to run a preview of my app logged in as a user, this would change based on that user's name. So if I jump over into my data tab once again, and from here, if I open up my app data and select on all of my users, I can see I have 2 users inside of my database that I've gone ahead and created. Now, if I was to run a preview of this page logged in as one of these users, it will now display the user's name field. So a way in which I can run a preview of that is by selecting to run as this particular user. And what that's going to do is run a preview of my app in a new tab, and it's going to log me in as that user. So as the current user, I am now Lachlan Kirkwood. And if I jump over to my app here, I can see that my static text has not changed, but my dynamic text has. So this now displays the words Lachlan Kirkwood. And look, if I was to run a preview of this as my second user, Simone Gibbs here, let's see what happens. I'm going to select this. It'll reopen this tab, run a preview of it logged in as Simone. So she is now the current user, and that text has in fact updated. Now, the beauty of text elements is that you can also use a combination of static and dynamic data. So if I quickly just delete everything here, I could say you're logged in as, and then I could insert dynamic data and reference the current user, their name. And if I run a preview of this, so going back over to my data tab, running a preview as Lachlan here, what you'll see is that combination of static and dynamic data. So it says you're logged in as Lachlan Kirkwood, which yes, I am. So you can really start to see how powerful text elements are inside of Bubble and how you can create that dynamic experience, which is going to differ for every single person that uses your app. So you can just personalize your app. And look, this is just a very basic example, but you can do things like create algorithms for social media feeds. You can display certain charts or visualizations to certain people that have certain access. The possibilities truly are endless here. And look, the same thing applies for something like an image element. So if I was to add an image onto my page here, what I could do is create a dynamic image. So similar to text, I could upload a static image or a dynamic image, and the static image obviously will not change. It will always be the same image. And the reason you'd want to use something like a static image is if you were displaying something like a logo for your company in the top left-hand corner of your header or your navigation menu, because that image will never change. Whereas with a dynamic image, this is perfect for displaying things like profile photos. Because if someone wants to see their profile photo, it's obviously going to change based on the person you're viewing. So if I was to insert dynamic data here, what I could do is reference the current user, so once again, the person who is logged in, their profile photo. And look, just a personal preference of mine is that I like to use this option to process images with this imgix. Now, this is just a way of reformatting the way in which this image is shown. And the reason why I do this is because I like to tick this option here to resize and fit the dimensions of this image by cropping it, which just means that the image is going to scale out and take up all of this space here. So if I was to now close this and click away, what you'll see here is that this text is now blue, which means that it is valid and Bubble will show that data. Whereas if this is red, you'll have an error message. And you'll be able to view all of your errors in this issue checker here, but I currently have 0 issues. So Bubble will actually tell you what you need to fix if you've got some sort of mistake in the way you're displaying data, or if something just doesn't add up. Bubble's going to take care of all of that for you, which is also why I love Bubble. But if I wanted to display that profile photo, let me jump to my data tab, open up my app data and select all of my users. I'm going to run a preview as Lachlan Kirkwood again, and you'll see his profile photo here. Whereas if I was to run a preview as Simone Gibbs, you'll see her profile photo take this place instead. So once again, we're creating a dynamic experience for all of our users. So that's kind of everything I just wanted to show you under your visual elements. You'll use visual elements very frequently inside a Bubble. Anytime you want to display information or relay any data from your database, this is what you're going to select. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete these here. If I scroll on down to the next series of elements, this is where things are going to get interesting. So this is what's known as your containers menu. And look, I previously touched base on this within our last module where I ran through an overview of how to create responsive apps inside of Bubble. But a container, as the name suggests, just allows you to store elements inside of them. Now look, containers are probably, in my opinion, some of the most important elements you will use. And later on throughout our course, I'm going to actually walk through exactly how to use every single one of these containers because they are incredibly important. But for the time being, I just want to give you an overview as to what they do, which I've kind of done in the past. Containers, as I mentioned, allow you to store elements inside of them, but they can be used to position elements around your page. So showing the real world example I'd given in the previous module, this is an example of a page that I'd built out. So in this example, I'd rebuilt an app like Yelp, which displays a list of reviews. And this is someone's profile page. So on the left-hand side, I had the user's profile information. And then on the right-hand side, I had all of the reviews that they'd published. Now, of course, all of these colors are individual groups. So a group is a container. As you can see right here, it sits within the containers menu. And when you color code your containers, it just allows you to see where you position elements on your page. So the whole purpose of containers is to, once again, allow you to determine how you can position the structure of your page. Now, they do also serve some additional purposes, but I don't want to get too deep into that right now, because as I said, later on, I'm going to explain everything you need to know in more specific detail. The next series of elements, though, is what's known as inputs. And inputs also are going to be very essential when you're working with Bubble. Inputs are what allows your users to, as the name suggests, input data into your database. So let's say you have a user registration page and you want a user to sign up with their email, their name, and a password. What you'll need to do is add a series of input fields onto the page. It's kind of self-explanatory, but it just allows someone to type into that input, which you can then store that data in your database. So for an input, let's say if I was to add a standard input on my page and if I was to click away, as you can see, the input just looks like a standard input. And if I was to run a preview of my app here, I'm just going to close this tab, what you'll see is that I can type into this input because I can input information. Now this becomes quite powerful because, as I mentioned before, you can allow users to type in information which can then be stored in your database. So that is incredibly essential. Another essential thing to factor about inputs is that you should always name these. And look, please, if you're going to take anything away from this section of my course today, it's exactly that. You should always give your inputs a name. Sometimes if I'm lazy, I won't name my groups accordingly, but your inputs are absolutely essential. So for every input, you should label what bit of information you're going to allow users to store in this. So let's say I want my users to add their name. What I'm going to do is call this input name. And the reason for this is because when I create an experience later on that allows me to store this data in my database, I need to be able to reference where that data sits inside of my app. And it's going to be inside of this input field. And if this input was incorrectly named or it had no name, it'd just be difficult to determine where that information is stored. Because if this was called, let's say, input email, but in reality someone wrote their name into it, I'm not going to know that this is the correct input field. And look, if it's called input A or input C, that's just very generic. I don't really know what information is in input C. Whereas right now, if I call this input name, I know for a fact that this is where I'm storing my user's name. Now, inputs obviously serve a great purpose where you can allow users to input data, and there's many different ways in which you can store that data. So there's things like a standard input, there's a multi-line input, which if I add this on, it kind of looks the same as a normal input, but with a multi-line input, as the name suggests, if users are going to type in a large body of text, it just always expands down and allows you to store all of that text inside of it. Whereas a standard input field will only allow you to store one line. There's also things like checkboxes, drop-down menus, they're a personal favorite of mine. You can add a series of options in here, so that way someone can choose from this list. So let's say if I was to have option A, and to create a second option, you just hit enter and add a new line. And option C, if I was to run a preview of this here, what I'll see is when I open up this drop-down menu, I have my 3 options there. Now, the beautiful thing about input fields, and this is kind of something else that I want to touch base on, is that like everything in Bubble, you have the option to add in some static choices. So by me typing in these 3 options, it will always display these exact 3 options. But of course, we always love that dynamic word in Bubble. And you also have the option to display a list of dynamic choices. So let's say, for instance, if you wanted users to choose from a list of something in your database that already exists, you could just set this as a list of dynamic choices, and it would pull those options from your database. So you just need to reference what options you want. And look, I don't want to overcomplicate things right now, so I'm not going to dive into that too much. But look, I just recommend you playing around with all of the different types of inputs. Another really common thing you'll use is probably search boxes, so that way you can search through data in your database. Also things like a date time picker, or even things like a picture uploader. So if I quickly just run a preview of these, what you'll see with the date time picker is that your users have the ability to select a date, it will store that, and with a picture uploader, when someone clicks this, whether they're on a desktop or a mobile, it'll open up their files or their camera roll, and it will allow them to upload an image. So if I do this right now, this is what it's going to look like. So when I click on this, it's going to open up the files on my computer, and I could upload a headshot here. And when this is done, it will display a preview of that image inside of this picture uploader. So I can now store that data inside of my database. Now, there are a couple of additional important things I just want to point out when it comes to the input fields. And one of those is just around the standard input field. And that is that under your appearance tab here, you're going to see a couple of different options. So there's some text here called placeholder, initial content, content format, and sometimes it's a little confusing to know what all of these things mean. So I just want to walk you through these now so you're not left with more questions than when you came into this video. So placeholder text, which you can see there's already some text inside of this, is kind of what the name suggests. It's just a placeholder that temporarily sits inside of this input field until a user starts typing. So if I run a preview of this page here, you can see this input field displays the word type here. However, as soon as I click in this and type, that text is removed. So it's just a placeholder until someone actually adds a value into this field. And look, the purpose of a placeholder is to just create a nice user experience. So I can see the placeholder on my drop-down menu is choose an option. So when I select on this, it shows me my options. And when I choose an option, it will replace that text. So you can customize this placeholder to whatever you want. So instead of choose an option, you could have it be select a choice. And when I run a preview of this, that is going to update. So I can now see it says select a choice. So it's completely up to you what you want to display inside of your placeholder. The other field that's really important is the initial content field. So what on earth is the difference between a placeholder and the initial content? The initial content is like a placeholder. So it's text that's going to sit in this input field, but unlike a placeholder, which disappears as soon as you type, the initial content will actually be a permanent value that sits inside of that input. And so what do I mean by that? If I was to, let's say, copy this placeholder text and just remove it, and if I paste this into the initial content, watch what happens when I run a preview of this. So immediately I can kind of tell that this text looks a bit different from placeholder text. It's not grayed out. And when I click in this and start typing, it doesn't remove the placeholder text. This is an actual value that sits inside of my field now. So if I wanted to store information, it would store the value type here. Now, what is the purpose of initial content? It's not for really displaying a prompt that someone should add into an input. Instead, it's normally used to display a value stored inside of your database. And what do I mean by that? Let's say if we were creating something like a user's settings page. And on this settings page, this is where someone can come and update any information stored in their profile. So things like their name, their email, their profile photo, maybe their bio. What you would do on that page is add a series of input fields. But because a user has already registered an account, we have that information stored in our database about them. So instead of leaving this input field blank, what we can do is display initial content to show the user the data we have already stored on them. So for instance, in this initial content field, what I could do is insert dynamic data, so similar to what we did with the text element, and I could display the current user, their name, or whatever information you would like. Now, even if I had my placeholder, which displays the word type here, if I run a preview of this page logged in as a user, if the value of the initial content actually has something to show, it will overwrite the placeholder text and just display this value instead. So if I jump to my data tab and run a preview of this logged in as Lachlan Kirkwood, I'm just going to close this tab. What you'll see is that my name is displayed inside of this input field. And when I click on this, I can see that this value does in fact sit inside of here. So I can modify it. So let's say my name was Lachlan Smith, but for some reason I've added in Kirkwood. What I could do is change my name, and later on you could hit a button that says save this information, and you could update that in your database. And once that's been updated, it will automatically be reflected because our initial content is pulling the user's name that's stored under their profile. Now look, the same thing applies for every single input field. They all have something known as the initial content or the default value, or sometimes the dynamic image. Regardless of what input field you use, you're going to see an option to be able to display static data or dynamic data. And 9 times out of 10 for input fields, it'll always be dynamic data because that's what we want to use Bubble for, to create a dynamic application that changes for each one of our users. Now, thankfully, that is all of the different types of elements you can use inside of Bubble. But before we wrap up here, there is one last thing I just want to show you, and that is what's known as your elements tree. So you'll kind of see that the elements tree here is broken down into 2 separate sections. On the bottom section, this is where you can add lots of new elements, which I've just explained to you. Whereas at the top here, you'll see it scrolls through and it actually shows all of the elements that sit on your page. So any single time you add an element on your page, Bubble's going to essentially index where that sits. And you can see here, when you click on an element, it will highlight it and open up the property editor for this specific element. So if you're ever looking for where the element is that displays the input name, you can select this and it will pull that up. Now, the reason why this is important is because when you add a series of groups to your page, sometimes your page can get a little bit overwhelming. So if you ever need to search for an element, you can do exactly that here. There is a way you can search and type in the name of an element. So if I was to jump over to the example application I'd shown you before, let me just expand the size of this here. What you'll notice is that this page here has a series of different groups. And so all of my elements sit inside of this purple group, which I can see I haven't actually given a proper name. And this is the importance of naming conventions. I've kind of caught myself out there. But if I was to open up this group, I can see all of the additional elements that sit inside of it. So I can see there's my group profile details, which I've actually named accordingly. So this is the white group here that displays a user's profile details. And if I open up or expand that group, I can see all of the elements that sit inside of this. So it's really important that you can actually get to use this elements tree, as it's just going to save you a whole lot of time later on when you need to open up and make any changes to elements that already sit on your page. But look, for now, that's everything I want to cover for the basic overview of the elements. I just wanted to give you an example about the different types of elements you can use. And later on, I am going to jump into some more specific details, particularly when it comes to things like container elements, just because they play a very important role in actually storing and displaying data throughout your app. But look, I don't want to overcomplicate things right now. So what we're going to do is just jump back to my Notion checklist and tick off that we've finished running through all of the different types of elements. that you can use whenever you're trying to build an app inside a bubble. Inside of this module, we're going to learn what on earth element styles are, when you should use them, and how to get the most out of them. Let's jump into our bubble editor and we can get started. When it comes to all things design in Bubble, the next important concept I need to explain to you is the idea of element styles. Now look, thankfully, in my opinion, this one is pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot that I need to explain, so why don't we just jump right into it. If we open up our Bubble editor, once again, I've just got a blank page here and I haven't made any real changes to my app. What I'm going to do is add a button element onto my page. Now, I've done this in a previous module. This isn't anything groundbreaking, but what I haven't pointed out is that when you select on this button and open up your property editor, under the appearance tab here, you'll see the option to be able to edit the actual appearance of the button, hence why this is called the appearance tab. Now, there's a couple of different ways in which you can do this. So the first and most obvious way in which you can change how this button looks is just by coming down to the colors here and just updating this manually. So for instance, I can see the background color of my button is this particular color code of blue. If I wanted to make this green, I could just drag this across, and as you'll see, that will update. So this is super straightforward. Now look, if you're building your own app, you might have a specific type of color style that you want to stick to, or a color palette with some different color codes. That's always a good thing to do before you start building out your app. But what you might notice is that as you start adding all of the different elements inside of your application, it can start to get a little bit hard to manage all of the different styles for every single element. And this is the benefit of creating a custom design style. So what on earth is a custom design style? Look, let's say if I wanted to add another button element onto my page, as you'll see, this has once again reverted to the default color, which was blue. So I would need to manually grab the exact same color code again, copy this, and then jump over to my second button and paste this in as the background color. And once we've done that, it would change to be green. But look, surely there's a better way than having to do this manually for every single element I add. And look, thankfully, there definitely is. So if we were to add a separate button onto our page, instead of manually updating the color here as a one-off color, what I'm gonna do is reference a style. So I've actually scrolled past the style setting here, but under the style heading, you'll see this drop-down menu, which contains a couple of different default options that have already been created. And so the purpose of a style is that it just saves you from having to manually update the color or the design style for every single element. What if you could actually just do it once and then have those changes applied to every single button or every other element that you add in the future? So by default, when it comes to things like button elements, Bubble has a couple of different options that have already been created. So because there is a style known as the primary button, Bubble has gone ahead and set the color of every single button you add to be this blue color, which is why it's happening. But if we were to, instead of manually changing these options, choose to edit this style, what you're going to see is it's going to take us through to this entirely separate page inside of our application. And if we were to look on the left-hand menu here, you'll see that it sits below our data tab. There's this styles menu. So this is where we currently are. If you want to get back to designing your app, you can select on the design tab, but for now, we're just going to select on the styles menu. And what you'll see here in the styles menu is that we can, similar to before, update all of the different colors for this button, but we can also update the default styles for every single other element that Bubble has created. So for our checkbox element, our drop-down element, our image elements, and absolutely everything else you can think of. So if we were to change the color of this button here, whenever we add a new button, the color of that will be reflected to this style. So a style is what's known as something universal. And by universal, it just means that it's going to be applied across your entire app. And I'll show you why that'll be super helpful in a moment. But let's go ahead and update the background color here to be, let's say, a light shade of, we'll go red this time. Or I kind of like this hybrid between red and orange there. And so as you can now see, the background color has updated here. And look, by all means, you're not limited to just changing the background color. You can update the roundness of the borders. So I could set this to be something like 20. You could update the size of the text, the font, the position of it, the styling of it, or even the condition on it. Now look, up to this point in our tutorial, I haven't really explained what conditions are, but I'm just going to quickly skip ahead and give you a quick overview here. A little bit of a spoiler alert. So right now I can see there's a condition here that just runs whenever this button is hovered. So whenever someone hovers their mouse over this, the button will be this color. And I can choose to turn this on to see what that looks like. Now obviously this is going to drastically change the color of my button from red to blue, which I don't really like. So what I could do is, instead of having it be blue, I could copy this exact same color code. I'll jump over to this condition and I'll paste in that same red color code I used, but I can make it a little darker. So I can now see that this is what the default color is going to be. And when I choose this condition, when I turn it on, it's going to be slightly darker. And so this is just going to create a much nicer user experience. Now, what I want to show you is what this is going to look like back in our design tab. So straight away, you're going to notice that the color of this button has been changed. But if I was to add a new button, you'll see that the color of this is also the same red style. And if I wanted to, let's say, update the previous buttons that were green, I could open up the style tab and choose these to be my primary button style, and they'll automatically have the exact same changes reflected. So instead of having to, let's say, manually change each one of my buttons, I can just do it in one place and those changes will be applied across everywhere in my app. Now this is great because if I wanted to, let's say, change the roundness of my borders or the color of the button, I can just choose to edit the primary button style. So let's say I want the roundness of my borders to be 10, not 20. If I jump back into my design tab now, every single button across every single page in my app has just been updated. I don't need to manually go and search for every single button and make that tweak. That would just take too much of my time. So this is the power of styles. Now, if I was to create a new page in my app, so if I open up my page drop-down menu and choose to create a new page, I'm just going to call this my test page. I'll create this here. Bubble will work its magic. And on this page, what I'm going to do is add a button. Now, once again, you're going to see that this button has the exact same design style. So of course, any changes we make in the overall style will be reflected across every page in your app. Now, something else I should just point out is that when it comes to styles, you're not limited to just creating one. You'll see that by default, Bubble actually gives you a couple of different design styles you can use, but you can always choose to create a new style and give this a name. So you could say that, for instance, this is your special button style. So I'm going to choose to create this. I could then choose to edit this style, and I could make this one kind of like a shade of gold in a way. And of course, you can choose to customize all of the exact same settings that I've just shown you. Now, the other benefit to using styles is actually a performance benefit. So if I jump back to my index page, every single time you change the design of an element, Bubble needs to load all of that information. It doesn't just happen out of the blue. So let's say if I've got 4 buttons on my page here, Bubble needs to load the information that says, hey, for my first button, this is the color code that we need to show. Now, if I had hundreds of elements with 100 different custom design appearances, that can be quite a bit of information for Bubble to load. So it might actually take longer to load your pages. Whereas the benefit of using a style is that because all of these elements share the exact same properties or settings, Bubble needs to only load that design style once. So for these 3 buttons, it's only loading the style once, and then it knows to apply that to the rest of them. So it's actually cutting back on how much data and information your app needs to load, which in turn will create a much faster end user experience when pages start loading inside of your app. And look, if I can be honest, that's probably the main gist of everything you need to know about design styles for right now. Design styles aren't just limited to buttons or visual elements. You can add these across containers, input forms, and anything else in between. And so if you really want to get the most out of design styles, I'd recommend just playing around inside of the Styles tab here, or even just choosing to manually add your own new style for things like input fields. So you can see here, there's just a standard input. Bubble doesn't give you too many default options. So you could create your own and add things like custom borders or shadows. It's entirely up to you. But for now, what I'm going to do is jump back over into my Notion checklist and tick off that we've finished running through the entire process of creating your own custom design styles. Throughout this module, I'm going to explain the difference between all of the different types of containers you can use and add into your app. Now look, containers are super important when it comes to structuring the overall interface of your app, so I'm super excited to jump into this one. As we continue learning about page design and elements, at this point in time, I just want to take a moment to focus particularly on a section that's very important here, and that is covering everything you need to know about containers inside of Bubble. And look, up to this point, we have actually touched base on some core aspects of a container. So I've explained to you what a group is and how it stores elements inside of it, and that's why it's called a container, because it's kind of like a Tupperware container where you store ingredients inside of it. But it is quite important that I run you through all of these specific nuances of not only just groups, but all of the different types of containers that you can choose from. So if we were to jump over to Bubble and head over to our elements tree here, I'm just going to reduce the size of that. If we scroll on down to our container elements, you'll see there is a long list here. Now look, I'm not going to teach you exactly how to use every single one of these in full depth, but what I do think is important is that I at least run you through what each container element is and when you should use it. So first of all, we have our group container. Now up to this point, as I've mentioned, I've already covered this in some detail. So groups are the best way to create the structure of your page exactly how you want it. So if I was to add a group onto my page, of course, it's broken down into these three separate menus. There's your appearance tab, the layout tab, and the conditional tab. This isn't new information, I've explained this before. The main thing to know about groups, of course, is that within the layout tab, groups, as well as every other container here, has the ability to set a container layout. So particularly when it comes to group elements, these are pretty much the exact same as your full page. They're kind of like mini pages inside of your overall page. So they function exactly as a page would, which means inside of this group, you can determine the order in which elements are displayed. So from top to bottom, being a column, or from side to side, being a row. Now I'm hoping that if you've made note throughout this tutorial, what I've just said isn't complete gibberish. So while groups are the best way to store multiple elements inside of them and create the page structure you're looking for, there are also a few additional benefits that I haven't touched base on. And one of them is being able to store data inside of them. So over in our appearance tab, what you might notice is that at the very top, you have these two input fields. And what this is referring to is that you have the ability to store some data inside of this group. And so if I was to open up my drop-down menu here, you can see a list of all of the data types I have in my database. So if you remember when I'd set up my database, I had a user data type, my comment data type, my post data type, and that satellite that was linked to that post. So this was my Instagram clone database that we had created. Now what you can actually do is choose to store the data of a particular data type inside of this group, and then you can send data to it. So for instance, if I wanted to store the value of a particular post from Instagram inside of this group, I could set the data type to be a post, but this would then mean I'd need to give it a data source. So from all of the posts in my database, I need to determine which post I want to display. So this is where you'd be able to perform a search in your database for all of the particular posts. And I realize that this is a new menu I'm showing you, but essentially you have the ability to store information inside of this group. But this is probably not the greatest example in terms of searching for a particular post. And the reason why I say this isn't a good example is because when it comes to the posts inside of your database, particularly if you're building something like an Instagram clone, you probably don't want to display just one post at a time. You'd want to display something like a feed of posts. And so that is where the next container element is going to come into play. Group elements, although they are powerful, only allow you to display one item. But as I just mentioned, what happens if you want to display a list of items? So thankfully, Bubble is already 2 steps ahead of us here, and they've created what's known as a repeating group. So I'm just going to delete this group off the page. We no longer need this. And I'm going to add this repeating group element. Now, a repeating group, as the name would suggest, is like a group that repeats itself. Pretty self-explanatory, I know. But in all seriousness, a repeating group is probably one of the most powerful elements Bubble has ever invented and will invent, and you're going to use lots of repeating groups throughout your time inside of Bubble. Whenever you need to display a list of items, you will need to use a repeating group. So let's talk about some scenarios where you'd need to do that. if you ever want to display a list of users. So if you're building something like a CRM and you want to show a list of users or clients, you would need a repeating group. If you want to create something like an Instagram clone or a social media website, if you want to display a list of posts, kind of like the homepage feed that you're used to, a repeating group is exactly what you would use. Long story short, if you're displaying a list of things, you need a repeating group. Now, the beautiful thing about a repeating group is that it actually functions the exact same as a normal group. So if we look at this repeating group here, it kind of just looks like a spreadsheet in a way. There's lots of different cells or rows, I guess you could say, inside of this. And the best way to think about this repeating group is that each one of these cells you see is an individual group. So right now I can see that there are 4. So if we were building something like an Instagram clone and we wanted to create a homepage feed, the first thing we'd need to do is just give this repeating group a data source. So if it wants to display a list of items in our database, we just have to let it know which items it should show. So for the type of content, I'd want to display a list of posts. And then for the data source, what you could do is perform a search in your database, which, to be honest, 9 times out of 10, this is the option you're going to use. I feel like I kind of skipped over that before and I apologize. But you'll quickly see in Bubble that this is going to be a very important option. So anytime you need to reference data stored in your database, you'll need to perform a search through your database for that information. So for the data source, you perform a search in your database for all of the posts. And if I close this, you will see that that will now validate. So this data source is just going to show every single post that has ever been created in my database, or in my Instagram clone for that matter. However, you can refine this search even more by adding what's known as constraints. So constraints are just like filters for your search. So if you wanted to create a custom feed for every single user, so a dynamic feed, meaning that if you logged into your Instagram account and you were viewing a list of posts, they would be completely different to the list of posts that I would see, because your posts would obviously be based off your interests and the people that you follow, whereas mine would be based off the people I follow and my own unique interests. And so this is where you can do exactly that. It's called adding constraints or adding filters. And so under your post data type inside of your database, if I quickly just digress and open up my data tab, you might remember that we have a series of data fields. And so these fields are where you can create your constraints. So what you'll see over in my design tab is that if I open up my search, you have the ability to filter all of your posts by these data fields here. Now look, I only have some pretty basic data fields, but you can create some advanced filters like being able to only display posts from people who someone is following. What you just need to know is that when it comes to constraints, the possibilities truly are endless. You can create some seriously powerful algorithms or even just search features for users. So I'm just going to close this here. Now there's a couple of other important things you need to know about repeating groups. When you're building out a repeating group, you can determine how many items are actually going to be displayed. So right now I can see for the number of rows, there are 4. And that's because we've currently set this as a value of 4. And because this is set as a fixed number of rows, this will only ever display 4 items. So let's say if I had 100 Instagram posts that I needed to show a user, right now it's only going to display the first 4 and then it will cut that off. Now that's not really the experience you want to create. So I personally never really use this option to keep it as a fixed number of rows. Instead, what I'll do is uncheck that, which now means it's going to continually just display posts until you run out of data or information to show your users. So if there were 100 posts, this repeating group would display 100 items. It would just continually scroll down your page and a user could scroll through it. You can also update the number of columns. So right now there is going to be 1 Instagram post per row. Now that's kind of the actual experience you'd want to create. But what happens if you went to a user's profile page where you can see the grid of posts? So there's normally 3 or 4 across each row. What you could do is update the number of columns. So you could say, hey, I want 3. And as you'll see, you'll get 3 specific columns. Or you could just unselect that this should be a fixed number. And as you'll see, it'll automatically span across the full width of your page and display as many as it possibly can. So now each one of these is an individual group. But look, thankfully, you don't need to be overwhelmed. You don't have to design every single element inside of each group here. And this is probably the best feature about repeating groups, and I hope you're ready, because this is going to change the way you build in Bubble. When it comes to a repeating group, you only need to build out the very first cell and it will automatically populate the rest of the cells for you. So what do I mean by that? Let's see what happens when I add a button into my first repeating group cell. As you can see, it's automatically added the exact same button into every other cell that you see. So you have to just design it once and then it will automatically be reflected. So if you were building something like an Instagram clone, all you'd need to do is add an image element into your very first cell, and then it would automatically add an image into every other cell for you. So you only have to do it once. Then what you could do with your image, and let me actually show you that example. So if I delete my button, I could grab an image element under my visual elements here. I could add this into the first cell of my repeating group. And look, I can see it's obscured my formatting, but let's not get distracted here. What I want to show you is how you can create that dynamic experience. So obviously in each cell of my repeating group, I want to display an image, but every cell is going to have a different image because every post will be different. So what you can do is insert dynamic data for this image in my very first cell, and I have the ability to reference what's known as the current cell. And in this case, it's called the current cell's post. So if every one of my repeating group cells was displaying a post, the image for each post will be different. So let's say if this is a repeating group cell, this is a repeating group cell, and that one is too, this cell will have a different image to this cell, and so on. So if you reference the current cell's post, you could pull out the information of each individual post's image, and it would automatically update accordingly. So that way it's going to display the image that belongs to each post. Now in this case, if you remember, I'd set up my satellite data field which stores my image for my actual post. So I just need to now reference that data from my satellite, and in this case, I can display that image. Then when I click away, as you'll see, this will turn blue and it will now validate. And so look, this was a general overview into what repeating groups can do. As I said, you can't avoid using repeating groups in Bubble. They are probably one of the most essential elements you will use throughout your time. And look, in the beginning, they can be a little bit overwhelming, but trust me, once you understand these few core concepts, they get much easier to use. And look, I think the best way to understand repeating groups is to just create a couple yourself. So perhaps in your database, you could create a couple of users, and then you could build a repeating group to display those users. And look, I have plenty of tutorials and courses that teach you how to use repeating groups in an extensive depth. All of my clone courses where I rebuild apps like Airbnb, Instagram, Uber, and pretty much everything else in between, they use tons of repeating groups throughout the process. So I definitely recommend checking them out if you still had any questions about these. But for now, what I want to do is delete this repeating group, scroll on down, and run you through the last few container options. So the next container, which is also a pretty frequently used one, is a pop-up. So if I add this pop-up onto my page, look, a pop-up is pretty self-explanatory. I'm sure you've used and engaged with pop-ups many times throughout your experience on the internet. But a pop-up, as the name would suggest, pops up over the top of your page. So you can see as I've added this pop-up on my page, it's kind of grayed out the rest of my page. So it adds a layer of opacity. So that way when a pop-up is being showed, it is front and center above your page. It kind of hovers over the top of it in a way. And look, pop-ups are super helpful because you can display information in them. A very common use case is getting people to subscribe or put in their email address, or if you want someone to register an account without having to actually go to a separate page. So pop-up elements are essentially a group that hovers over your page. This looks and functions exactly like a group. So you can store data in them, you can set the container layout, you can change all of the dimensions. This is just a group floating over the top of your page. Now, one thing I should point out is that when it comes to pop-ups, these will be hidden by default. So if I was to click away here, this is what my pop-up's going to look like whenever my page is loaded. So it's not going to be shown. Pop-ups will only be shown when you reference them within a workflow. Now look, I don't want to get too ahead of myself here, but later on in the next module, I'm going to explain how you can actually build out workflows, which actually create some functionality inside of your app. So what you could do, for instance, is let's say when someone clicks this button, we should show this pop-up. And you know what? I'm going to break my rule and show you exactly how we can build that. But if you get confused while we build out the workflow, don't stress because I've got a whole module that's going to cover how to do this. So if our pop-up is currently being hidden, what we can do is scroll on up to my elements tree. I might just expand this. And I can currently see that my pop-up is on the page, but because this little eye is closed, it means it's not being shown. And if I want to show that, I can click on this and I can make any changes to it if I want. And if I want to close it, I can click that eye or I can just click away. But let's say I want to select this button. What I'm going to do is choose this option to add a workflow. And this is going to take us through to our workflow tab. Now, the reason why I'm showing you how to build this is because it is super straightforward. All we need to do is head to our element actions, and I'll explain what element actions are in my later module in this tutorial. But if we choose to show an element, I can choose to show my pop-up. Now, if I run a preview of this page, what you'll see is at the top of the page, we'll have our red button. When I click on this, our pop-up is shown. And when I click away, it will hide that pop-up. So that's why you can see the benefit of pop-ups. Sometimes you don't always need to show information to users. You only just need to show it temporarily within a pop-up. So that's what you can do. I'm just going to close this though, jump back to my design tab, delete my button, and also delete my pop-up, because the next container I'd like to show you is going to be a floating group. And at this point in time, it kind of just sounds like Bubble's making up names for different types of groups, but I assure you these do have a use case. A floating group, if I add this onto my page, kind of does what the name suggests. It just floats over the top of your page. And look, it's kind of hard to tell at this point in time. So perhaps the best way to illustrate this is by first of all deleting this floating group and adding a couple of elements onto my page. So I'm just going to add a button element here. And I actually might add another one just for the sake of showing my tutorial. Now, if I was to add a group onto my page, the group itself sits on the page. So if you watch this, when I go to my containers menu and add a group, it's obviously going to sit below my two buttons, because on my overall page, we've set the container layout to be a column, meaning all of my elements will be stacked from top down. So this is doing exactly what we've told it. So I might just quickly change the background style of this group to a color. Sorry if I'm whizzing through this, but I just want to show you that we can actually see where this group sits on my page. But what happens if you want to create an experience where your group should always sit at the top of your page, no matter how far you scroll down? And why would you want to do that? Well, things like navigation menus are usually known as a floating group. So if I add this floating group onto my page, as the name suggests, and this is where you can really see it coming to life, this group floats over the top of every other element on my page. So it's kind of like a pop-up in that it sits over the top of the page, but there's no opacity around it. Nothing's grayed out. This group just looks and feels like a standard group. Although you will see here, we have a couple of additional options which just determine where this group can sit. So right now I can see it's floating at the top of my page, which means that if I keep scrolling down my page, this group will always stay at the top in the exact same position. And why would you want to do that? As I mentioned before, if you're building something like a navigation menu at the top of a page, and perhaps the best way to illustrate this is just by showing you a real world example. So if I go over to my website here, and if I scroll down, you can see that the menu at the top here does not move. It always floats over the top of any content as we scroll on down the page. This is exactly what a floating group will do. So if I jump over to Bubble here, what I'm going to do is actually just give this group a background color. I'll make it a shade of blue. And look, I'm just going to quickly reduce the size of it. I can see that the height is 250 pixels. I'll make that a fixed height. And I'm just going to set this to be 100, so it's slightly smaller. Or maybe I should even go 50. There we go. Now, if I was to update the width of this, and look, I apologize if I'm just speed running through this, but what I want is the width of this group to scale across the full size of my page. So if I unselect this and leave the maximum width as infinite, it's going to take up as much space as it can. Now, if I run a preview of this page, what you'll see is that this group sits at the top of my page. But watch what happens when I scroll down. As I continue scrolling, it covers up all of the elements on my page. So it works the exact same as a navigation menu. So that's why you would want to use a floating group. Now with a floating group, these are exactly the same as a normal group. You can store data in them. You can update the container layout. And in most cases, the container layout will probably be a row, because if you look at the floating group on my website, all of these elements are stacked horizontally, so from side to side. So that's why I say you'll probably want to use the row option. But the other thing I just want to point out is that you can position these elements to the bottom of your page. So if you want some sort of navigation experience like you'd see on a mobile app like Instagram where everything's down the bottom, this will allow you to create that exact experience as well. Now, something that goes hand in hand with floating groups is the very last element I want to run you through, and that is the focus group, or as Bubble calls it, the group focus. So what on earth is a focus group? I think the best way to illustrate this is by once again just showing you my website. So on my website here, if we open up the courses section, you can see we've got this drop down section that's kind of like an extension of my menu. And in Bubble, this would be known as a focus group. So a focus group, once again, looks and functions exactly like a normal group, but the position of where that group sits on your page will be determined on what element it's focused to. And don't stress, I understand that everything I said there was very technical and confusing, so I think the best way to illustrate this is just by showing you a real example. What I'm going to do is just delete my buttons here. I'm going to delete that group. I'm going to keep my floating group though, and I'm going to position this at the top of my page. Now let's say inside of this floating group, I have a button. There you go. And when this button is clicked, what I want to show is some sort of drop down menu. This is where a focus group is going to come into play. So if I grab a focus group, I can add this anywhere on my page. And similar to a floating group, a focus group hovers over the top of your page. It doesn't sit directly in your page. So a focus group and a floating group are kind of like close relatives. However, the main difference is that a focus group won't automatically sit at the top or the bottom of your page. It will sit based on a reference element. So before I even jump into this, I just want to explain that a focus group works and functions exactly the same as a normal group. You can store data in this. You can update the container layout, the dimensions of it, the color of it. It's pretty much the exact same as a group with the ability to determine where this should be positioned on your page. So if you give this a reference element, and in this case, I want it to be our button, you will now see that this element will sit directly below this button here. So this group will only be displayed whenever you click this button. Now look, you will need to build a workflow to actually show that. So by default, a focus group is hidden on your page. You don't see it. It's only when you click this button that it would show this. And because the reference element is this button, wherever this button is on your page, this group will be displayed under it. Now you can also update things like how close it is to this button. So you could give it what's known as offset, which is kind of just like margin. So it just says, hey, there's 20 pixels of space there, and I want to add 20 pixels of space from my border. But look, I feel like right now I'm getting a bit carried away. The only reason I've ever used a focus group is to create this kind of drop-down experience. So it's not something I'll commonly use. 9 times out of 10, if I'm building groups, it's definitely just a standard group or a repeating group. And look, that's pretty much all of the containers I want to run you through. There is this table element. Look, at this point in time, it's currently in beta. And if I can be honest, when it comes to creating a table, which looks like this, I'm not the biggest fan. I think if you're going to use a table, you may as well just use a repeating group. A repeating group is going to do the exact same thing, and it's not in beta. So it's going to have less bugs, and you know for a fact that a repeating group is going to stick around. Sometimes when things are in beta, if they don't have good adoption, they don't really stick around for very long. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be the case here, but look, I certainly don't want to have to re-record this tutorial if Bubble ever pulls this element out. But from the feedback I've seen across the Bubble community, a lot of people just use repeating groups because a table kind of looks and functions the exact same as a repeating group. So you've got a bunch of different cells here, you edit it in a very similar way, and so it doesn't really add a whole lot of value. But from here, that is all of the different types of containers. I hope this shares a little bit more of an insight as to when you should use each container and what you can do with each container. For now though, I just want to jump back to my Notion checklist and tick off that I finished walking you through not only groups, repeating groups, pop-ups, and of course the focus group and the floating group as well. Within this module, I'm going to explain to you how you can actually send and store data within a page to create a truly dynamic experience. Now this is one of Bubble's core superpowers, so I'm super excited to show you how this works. Moving down through the list of things I want to cover under our page design and elements. Look, this was quite an extensive list and we're almost getting to the end of it. There's just 3 more points that I need to cover. And one of those is being able to create what's known as dynamic pages. This is a super powerful feature that Bubble has, and this is why most people come to use Bubble as a no-code tool and not other options. So if we were to jump over to my Bubble editor here, what I've done is I've just created a little bit of an example to illustrate my point on what we're about to do. So what I should start by saying is, what on earth is a dynamic page? Look, we've talked about the difference in my tutorials so far about static and dynamic. These are two terms you'll often hear when it comes to no-code tools. Now, if you remember, when it comes to static things, that is information that does not change. So if you're building something like a website for a local business and all you need to display is some information on it, like the opening hours, the about section, and maybe even a map, that information will never change. I mean, you can change it, but you manually have to go in and update it. So that is known as static information. Whereas on the other hand, the main reason why people use Bubble is to create dynamic applications. And these are, of course, applications that change to the user as they're actually using the platform. So no two users will see the same thing. And so that then begs the question, what happens if you need to display information in your database where you've got hundreds or maybe even thousands of entries? And so what do I mean by that? I'm going to quickly jump over to a separate page here. And this is known as my profile page. Now, this isn't too elaborate, but essentially this is a user's profile page. So if we ever wanted to view the information about a user in something like our Instagram clone that I've talked about, this is where you could do that. Now on this page, it's nothing elaborate. All I've got is a menu at the top, which is just a big orange group with some elements inside of it. Then I've got an image element here, which is the circle you see. That's going to display someone's profile photo. And then below this, I've got a text element, which will display someone's name. Now, let's say in theory, we had 1,000 people who have signed up to our platform. If I wanted to display a profile for every single one of those users, you might think that we actually need to manually create 1,000 different pages. Now, look, that's just not possible. It's not feasible, and there's not enough hours in the day to do it. And this is where the real power of Bubble comes into play. In Bubble, instead of having to create 1,000 unique pages, you only have to create one page. And in that page, you can choose to store some data in it. So we could tell Bubble, hey, on this page, we're going to display the data of a user. And then every time someone opens this page, based on the user they want to view, we could send the data of that user and then display just their information in this page. So if you had, let's say, of those 1,000 people who have signed up to your Bubble app, if 100 of them were using your application at once, and they all decided to click on a different person's profile, they would all be sent to this exact same page, but they would all see a different thing. They would see the user who they have selected to view. And that is why Bubble truly blows my mind. This is where you really start to see the power of the dynamic application come into play. So in my example today, I just want to walk you through how we're going to do this. So on my homepage, I've added a repeating group here with a list of users. Now, if you remember from our previous section where I talked about containers, a repeating group is where you can display a list of items. So this is what one will look like once it's built out. In this repeating group, all I've done is I've performed a search in my database for all of my users. So I've set the type of content to be a user, and the data source here is performing a search for every single user. Now I don't have any constraints here, so it's just going to show every single user that's signed up to my platform, which if I quickly just digress and open up my data tab, under my app data here, I can see that I have about 5 different users. So it's going to display all of these people. Now, something I should also just quickly point out is that I've made sure I don't have any privacy settings on my user data type. Sometimes Bubble by default will actually add a privacy setting. So if this does not say publicly visible, you just need to make sure it does. And in order to do that, you just click on this. It'll take you through to your privacy tab. And then if you have a privacy rule, you can just hit, there's normally a little trash can icon and you can delete that. The reason I say that is because if you have a privacy rule by default, it will not allow you to see a list of all of your users. Now back to my example. What I've done is I've displayed a list of users. That's easy to understand. But let's say when I click to view someone's profile, I want to be sent over to the profile page and I want to view the information for this specific user. So in order to do that, if I head over to my profile page, the first thing you need to do before you build out any elements is just double click on the overall page. So I can see this is my profile because that's the name of the page. And a page works just like a group, or a group works like a page. And if you remember, one of the powerful things about a group is that you can store data in them. And this is a great example of when you would do that. So if we give our page a type of content, so we can say on this page, we're going to display a user. So one given user at any point in time. Now what happens is that Bubble knows when you send someone through to this page, you are now required to send through the data of a specific user that you would like to show. So in order to do that, what you need to do is build out a workflow. And look, in the next section of my course, we are going to talk about workflows, but I think that I can't really get away in not showing you what a workflow looks like to illustrate my point here. So when someone clicks on this view profile button, I'm going to choose to add a workflow. It'll take us through to our workflow tab. I feel like I'm giving away lots of spoilers here. But what I want to do is choose a navigation event, which is look pretty self-explanatory. And I'm going to send someone through to a page. And the destination page will be my profile page. But what you'll see is because we've stored a type of data on that destination page, this little box here is now red, which means that we have to send through a type of data to that destination page. And so the data I want to send is a particular user. And it's the user whose profile I'm choosing to select from my repeating group. And in this case, that's just known as the current cell's user, because in our repeating group, each cell displays a different user. So if I select the user in cell number 3, I'm going to send that particular user. Whereas if I click cell number 1, it's going to select that user. Then over on my profile page, if you were to add an element, you'll be able to reference the data that you have sent through to this page. Now, in my example today, I'm just displaying a user, but that is just one use case scenario. You can send whatever data you would like. It doesn't have to be just a user. I just think that a user is the easiest way to explain and illustrate my point. So if we were to add a text element onto my page that displays the name of the person that we've just sent through in our workflow, what you would need to do is insert dynamic data. And you'll now see that you not only have the option to reference the current user, but there's this new option known as the current pages user. Now these can get quite confusing, so I need to explain what is the difference between the two. Because we've stored a data type in our page, and that data type is our user data type, Bubble knows that on this page, we are now going to store one particular user. So that is known as the current pages user. It's the user stored in our page. Whereas the current user is the person who is using your application at this point in time. So let's give an example. If you had an Instagram account and I also had an Instagram account and you wanted to view my profile, you are the person who is logged in and you've just selected to be sent through to my profile. That means that because my information is being displayed on the page, I would be the current page user. And because you're logged in using the app, you are the current user. So that's the difference between the two. So if we wanted to display the information of the person whose profile we're viewing, we would reference the current pages user. And then from here, you can pull any of the data fields for this particular person. And in this case, I just want to display their name. And that is all you would need to change. And so on this page here, I'm just going to delete this because I've already added in the current pages user's name. That was a bit of a tongue twister, as well as their profile photo. So I just want to show you what this experience is going to look like. So if I head to my index page here and I choose to run a preview of my app, what you're going to see is a list of all of the users who have signed up to my platform. And what I'm going to do is view the profile of James Gray here. So I'm going to click this button. It's going to run that workflow. It's going to send us through to the profile page, which I can see in our URL here. But what you'll also notice is it's sent through this long string of characters. And this is the unique ID for James's profile. So if we quickly just jump into our Bubble database, head to our app data and select all users. Every single time an entry is created in your database, Bubble will create a unique ID for that. And the way you can view this is by selecting this pencil icon, and you'll see there's a field here known as the unique ID. So this will automatically be applied to anything you create. It's not just limited to users, it also is relevant to any other data type you build out. And so this is that long string of characters. And so Bubble just knows that when it sees that URL, it needs to display this user. Let's jump back to our homepage though, and let's say we want to view someone else's profile. We want to view Simone here. let's click this button. It'll send us through to this page, and you can see that it's sent through the data of Simone. So this is a dynamic page that's constantly going to change and display and reflect the data that a user requests at any given point in time. Now, the beautiful thing about all of this is that this feature is not just limited to pages. Because a page is like a big container, you can replicate this across any of your other container elements. So let's say instead of sending someone through to a dedicated page to view their profile, you just wanted to display their information in a pop-up. You could do exactly that. So if we head to our containers menu and grab a pop-up, we could add this pop-up onto our page. And as you'll see, similar to the page, we can give this a type of content, and we can say we want to display the data of a user. Now, in this case, we don't know which user we want to display at any given point in time. This should be dynamic. So what you can actually do is send this data through a workflow. So if I was to close this pop-up, click on my button and edit that workflow, let's say that instead of sending someone through to a profile page, what we want to do is open up a pop-up. So if I head to my element actions, I would show an element, and that element would be that pop-up that I've just created. But we also need to create an action that sends some data through to that pop-up. So if we head to our element actions and choose to display data, we have the ability to send the data to my pop-up, and the data to display will need to be a user, which can be the current sales user. And look, part of me is kind of regretting showing you guys this example because this is a lot more confusing, and I haven't really explained what workflows are yet. So please don't stress if this is a little confusing for you. I apologize for jumping the gun. But essentially what's happening here is we're opening our pop-up and we're sending the data of a user through to it. Although pop-ups are similar to pages, they do just require you to send data through in a slightly different way because you have to obviously send the data and then display the element. Whereas with a page, that all just happens in the same step. So what would now happen is let's open up our pop-up. So let's go to our elements tree. I can see it's here. I'll open this up. And if I add a text element on this, I'm going to insert dynamic data and I'm going to reference the parent group's user. So because our pop-up isn't a page, it's no longer called the current pages user. Instead, it's known as the parent group. So the parent group is the group that this element sits within. So my text element sits in the container, which is my pop-up. So the container is the parent because the container is kind of just taking care of all of the elements inside of it. So in this case, I'd want to reference the parent group's user, their name. And look, if I refresh this and run a preview of my app, let's see what's going to happen. When I click to view Lachlan Kirkwood's profile, it's going to display my name. I could click away and choose to display Gwen Mills here, and it would display her name. So this is going to update dynamically once again. And look, when we cover the section of my course where I explain everything about workflows, this will make a lot more sense. But for the time being, that's how you can create dynamic experiences on pages as well as any container element like groups. Let's jump back into our Notion checklist and tick this one off our list. And just like that, that is all I have time to include within this YouTube tutorial today. This video is already dragged on for hours, so I really don't want it going for any longer. But look, if you want to get access to the rest of this course, please do not stress. You can definitely do that for free. All you just need to do is hit the link in the description of this video, and it'll allow you to stream the entire full course. Now, once again, that is going to be completely free. I'm not going to charge you a cent, but I just don't want this video dragging out too long on my YouTube channel. I truly hope that up to this point, you've already learned a couple of valuable insights along the way. But look, there is still so much that I need to cover. Within the full course, I'm going to cover all of the important bubble features that you need to know. So things like custom states, page parameters, option sets, plugins, how to actually publish your app, and everything else in between. So once again, if you want to get access to the rest of this course for free, just hit the link in the description of this video. In the meantime though, if you also want to stay up to date with any additional bubble resources I share, I'd always recommend hitting that subscribe button on my channel, so that way you're the first to know whenever I drop a new tutorial. For now though, I've rambled on for far too long. That's everything from me today. I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.